I set up camp deep in the national forest, miles from the nearest road. The plan was simple, just a few days alone, away from everything. I had my gear, my food, and enough firewood to last. It was late in the season, the air crisp with the first hints of winter, but the days were still warm enough. The first day was perfect. I found a flat clearing near a small creek, far from any trails. No other campers, no signs of people at all. Just trees, the sound of the water, and the distant calls of birds. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon hiking around, exploring. Felt good to be out there, cut off from everything. That night, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The night air settled around me, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I had expected some nighttime sounds, owls, coyotes, the occasional crack of a branch as an animal moved through the woods. Instead, it was eerily quiet, too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the soft crackle of my fire. Put me on edge, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I woke sometime in the middle of the night to a sound outside the tent, faint rustling, something moving through the dry leaves. It was steady, slow, deliberate, not the scurry of a small animal, something heavier. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. The sound moved closer, circling the tent. I reached for my flashlight, my heart pounding. I waited, listening. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I stayed awake for a long time, waiting, but there was nothing else. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, some harmless animal, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and checked around. The ground was covered in dry leaves and soft dirt, easy to leave tracks in, but there were none. No prints, no sign that anything had been near my tent at all. I shook off the unease and went about my day. I hiked for hours, following the creek upstream, climbing over fallen logs and through dense undergrowth. The sun was bright, the forest full of life. Birds chirped, squirrels rustled through the trees. The night before felt distant, like a dream. By the time I made it back to camp, I was exhausted. I built a fire and cooked dinner as the sun dipped behind the trees. The woods grew darker, shadows stretching long across the ground. The quiet settled in again, just like the night before. I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker, listening. Then I heard it, a single sharp crack, a branch snapping in the distance. I tensed, scanning the trees. The firelight only reached so far, beyond that, just darkness. Another crack, closer. I reached for my flashlight and swept it through the trees. Nothing, just empty woods. Then the smell hit me, rotting.
Wet, decayed.
Like old meat left out in the sun. It drifted in on the still air, thick and cloying. My stomach turned. I stood, backing toward my tent. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had a knife, a fire, my truck not too far away. I wasn't helpless. The smell lingered for a while, then faded. The woods stayed silent. I sat by the fire until exhaustion finally pulled me to bed. I woke up to a sound outside my tent. Close, too close, breathing, not the light, quick breath of an animal. This was deep, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, gripping my knife. The thin nylon of the tent suddenly felt like nothing at all, a flimsy barrier between me and whatever was out there. The breathing moved, shifting around the tent, slow and steady. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I didn't move for what felt like hours. Finally, as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was crisp, cold. The smell was gone, but the footprints were there, big, deep, leading from the trees, circling my tent, then disappearing back into the woods. I packed up. I didn't eat, didn't stop, just tore down my tent, shoved everything into my pack, and started back toward my truck. The whole time I felt watched. The silence hung heavy, unnatural. I reached my truck and threw my gear in the back. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I glanced back toward the tree line. Something was there, just beyond the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Tall, too tall, standing still, watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine and tore down the dirt road, not stopping until I hit pavement, not looking back. I never went back to that spot, never tried to figure out what I had seen. I didn't want to know. I had been planning the trip for weeks, checking maps, watching the weather, making sure I had everything I needed. I wanted something remote, deep in the forest, far from the usual campsites. I found the spot after hours of studying satellite images. A small clearing by a river, miles from the nearest road. It was exactly what I was looking for. I packed everything carefully. My tent, sleeping bag, a small cooking setup, enough food and water for 5 days, and a few emergency supplies just in case. I carried a knife, a hatchet, and a bear spray canister. I had done plenty of solo trips before and knew how to prepare. The drive took nearly half a day, first on paved highways, then on gravel roads, then onto an unmarked dirt track that wound through dense trees. I parked as far as I could go before the road became impassable, then shouldered my pack and started hiking. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and the only sounds were birds and the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. It took 3 hours to reach the clearing. It was perfect, a flat spot by the river, just enough open space to set up camp but still surrounded by trees. The water was clear and cold, moving fast enough that mosquitoes wouldn't be a problem. There was no sign that anyone had camped here before. I pitched my tent near the tree line, close enough to the river for easy access, but not so close that I'd have to worry about flooding if it rained. I gathered firewood, set up my cooking gear, and by the time the sun started dipping behind the trees, I had a small fire going. I ate, listened to the sounds of the forest, and felt the tension of the outside world fade away. That first night was uneventful. The fire crackled, the river rushed, the wind stirred the trees. I lay in my tent, staring at the fabric above me, feeling completely alone in the best way possible. The next day I explored. I followed the river upstream, climbing over fallen logs, picking my way through thick undergrowth. The deeper I went, the wilder it felt. No footprints, no signs of human activity, just untouched forest stretching in every direction. I filled my water bottle, rested on a rock for a while, then headed back. That night, something woke me, a sound outside the tent, close. I held my breath, listening. It was slow, deliberate, not the random movement of an animal foraging. My hand found the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to make out shapes beyond the thin fabric of the tent. Something moved, a shadow. I stayed still, gripping the knife, waiting. The sound circled the tent, slow and steady, then faded into the trees. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally unzipped the tent and peered outside, there was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a bear passing through, but it hadn't felt like an animal. The third day, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Everything felt too quiet. The birds weren't as loud, and I hadn't seen a single squirrel or rabbit all morning. I forced myself to focus on small tasks, collecting more firewood, boiling water, checking my gear. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent, listening. The wind picked up, making the trees creak. I strained my ears for any sound out of place. Hours passed. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not heavy, not fast. Just slow, measured steps circling the tent. I gripped my knife, heart pounding. The sound moved closer, then stopped right outside. The fabric shifted slightly, like something was pressing against it. Couldn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I sat up the rest of the night, fire roaring, knife in hand. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed fast, barely stopping to eat. The whole time I felt watched. The feeling was so strong it made my skin crawl. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, but I knew something was out there. The hike back felt twice as long. Every snapped twig made my pulse spike. I kept checking behind me, scanning the trees. I never saw anything, but the feeling never left. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my pack in and locked the doors before I even started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something step out of the trees. Nothing did, but I never camped there again. I picked a remote spot in the national forest to camp alone for a few days. I had been feeling the weight of everything: work, city life, the constant noise. I wanted silence, space, and the feeling of being out there with nothing but nature around me. The spot I chose was miles from any main road, accessible only by an old fire access road that had clearly seen better days. It was rutted, overgrown in places, and I had to ease my truck over rocks and through deep muddy patches more than once. I liked it that way. Fewer people meant more solitude. I found a clearing near a small creek, big enough for my tent and fire setup, but still surrounded by thick forest. Tall pines stretched high, their needles blanketing the ground in a soft, quiet layer. The only sounds were birds, the rustle of branches in the breeze, and the distant trickle of water. I set up camp, got a fire going, and settled in. The first day was peaceful. I hiked a bit, took my time collecting firewood, and cooked a simple meal as the sun set. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and earth thick around me. When night fell, I crawled into my sleeping bag and let the quiet settle over me. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Everything was still, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Then I heard it, a sound just beyond the tent. A light, deliberate step on pine needles. I held my breath, listening. Another step, slow, careful. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? A raccoon? I reached for the flashlight beside me, heart pounding. Before I could switch it on, the sound stopped. I waited, every muscle tense, straining to hear past the heavy silence. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal and eventually forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around the camp but didn't see any tracks. I let it go. The second night, it happened again. This time, I was sure it wasn't just an animal. I heard footsteps circling the tent, slow and deliberate, pausing every few steps. My skin crawled. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Then, the footsteps stopped directly behind the tent. I waited, my pulse hammering in my ears. Minutes passed, then nothing, just silence. The next morning, I checked the ground again. This time, I found something. A single boot print in the soft dirt near the back of my tent. Not mine. I stared at it for a long time, my mind refusing to fully accept what I was looking at. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. The edges were still defined, the soil not completely dried out. Someone had been near my tent in the night, watching. I should have packed up and left right then. But I told myself it could have been a hiker passing through, someone who got lost or curious. I didn't want to believe anything worse. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I hiked, fished in the creek, did anything to keep myself from staring into the trees, searching for movement. By evening, I convinced myself it was all in my head. That night, I kept my fire burning longer. I sat up late, staring into the dark, listening. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Then, just as I was starting to think maybe I'd imagined it all, I heard something. Not footsteps this time, breathing. Slow, steady, just beyond the firelight. The hair on my arms stood up. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dark, my heart hammering. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was nothing but blackness. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there, watching, breathing. I stood up, forcing myself to move, to act. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it into the trees. Nothing. The breathing stopped. The silence was heavier than before. I backed toward my tent, keeping the light aimed into the forest. My hands were shaking. I crawled inside, zipped it shut, and kept my knife close. I barely slept. At first light, I made my decision. I was done. I packed up camp in record time, throwing things into my truck, not caring about organization. I needed to be out of there. As I loaded up, I glanced toward the trees one last time. And that's when I saw it. A shape deep in the woods, just far enough back that I could only make out the outline of a person standing between the trees. Not moving, not hiding, just standing there, watching me. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I didn't stay to get a better look. I climbed into my truck, locked the doors, and tore out of there, bouncing over the rough trail, not stopping until I hit pavement miles away. I didn't look back. I don't know who it was. I don't know how long they had been out there watching, and I don't want to know. I set up camp by the river, deep in the forest where the only sounds were the rush of water and the occasional bird call. It had taken hours to hike in, following a barely visible trail through thick trees. This was exactly what I wanted, complete isolation. Just me, my tent, and the wilderness. The spot was perfect. A flat patch of ground near the water, surrounded by towering pines and dense underbrush. I had planned for this trip meticulously. A week alone to reset my mind, to escape everything. I had enough food, a good tent, a reliable water filter. Everything was supposed to go smoothly. The first day was uneventful. I gathered firewood, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the river as the sun dipped behind the trees. The temperature dropped fast. The forest felt different at night, more closed in. The sounds changed, too. The birds went silent, replaced by the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Small animals, I told myself. Nothing to be concerned about. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. Something had snapped a branch close to my tent. I stayed still, listening. Heavy steps, slow, deliberate, not an animal. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the tree line. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Minutes passed. Finally, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. I turned the flashlight off and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. No tracks, no signs that anything had been there. I pushed it out of my mind. Maybe a deer had wandered close. Maybe my half-asleep brain had exaggerated the sounds. I spent the day exploring, hiking along the river, enjoying the solitude. Everything felt normal again. The night before had just been nerves, nothing more. That night, the footsteps came back. I heard them earlier this time, just as I was settling into my sleeping bag. A slow, steady crunching in the underbrush, closer than before. I held still, my breath shallow. It wasn't the random movement of an animal. These were deliberate steps, circling my campsite. I gripped my knife, every muscle tense. Then silence. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, I was on edge. I debated packing up and leaving, but I had hiked so far in. It could have been anything. A curious animal. A lone hiker who didn't realize they were near someone's camp. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but it clung to me. I spent the day moving, keeping busy. I built up my fire, gathered extra wood. The sky darkened early, heavy clouds rolling in. It was going to rain. That night, the storm hit hard. Wind howled through the trees, rain hammering against my tent. The river roared louder than before, swollen with the sudden downpour. But through it all, I still heard footsteps, faint but there, pacing just beyond the fire's glow. I stayed awake, gripping my knife, waiting. The storm eventually passed, but I never heard the footsteps leave. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, my body aching from tension and lack of sleep. Something was different. The firewood pile I had built up the day before was gone. Not scattered, not knocked over. Gone. I searched around my campsite, heart pounding. A few feet away, in the mud near the tree line, were footprints. Large, deep, human. I wasn't alone out here. I packed up in record time, shoving everything into my pack with shaking hands. I didn't care about the weight, didn't care about the aches in my legs as I started back down the trail. I just needed to leave. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. Took me most of the day to get back to my car. When I finally reached it, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors, my breath coming in gasps. The forest was still quiet, but I knew someone had been out there, watching me, walking around my tent at night, taking my firewood. I drove away without looking back. I set out early in the morning, my backpack heavy with supplies as I hiked along the overgrown trail. The forest was thick, the trees pressing in from both sides, their branches forming a tunnel of green above me. The plan was simple: 3 nights alone in the backcountry, miles away from any roads or people. It was something I had done before, but never this deep into unfamiliar territory. The hike took longer than I expected. The trail was barely maintained, with fallen logs and tangled roots making every step a challenge. The weight of my pack dug into my shoulders, and the late summer heat had me sweating through my shirt by midday. I stopped at a small creek to refill my water and rest, sitting on a moss-covered rock while listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was exactly what I had wanted. By the time I reached my planned campsite, the sun was already dipping low. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving river, the kind of spot that looked untouched. I set down my pack, stretching out my sore muscles before getting to work setting up my tent. The ground was soft with damp soil, and the trees around me were thick enough to provide some cover from the wind. I built a small fire, eating a quick meal from my food stash before letting the flames die down. The night air was cool, and I crawled into my sleeping bag early, feeling the exhaustion from the hike catching up to me. The forest outside my tent was alive with the sounds of insects, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the soft rustling of the river nearby. I fell asleep almost instantly. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The fire outside had long since burned down to embers, leaving the campsite in total darkness. I lay there listening. The forest was quieter than before. The usual sounds of night creatures had faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just outside my tent. My pulse slammed in my ears. The sound wasn't the random scurrying of an animal. It was something heavier, something careful. The steps crunched against the forest floor, moving from one side of my tent to the other. I held my breath, my muscles locked in place. The steps stopped. I strained my ears, trying to pick up anything in the thick silence. I couldn't see outside, and I wasn't about to unzip the tent to look. The seconds stretched into minutes. My mind raced with possibilities. A bear? Unlikely. It would have been noisier, and I would have heard it long before now. A deer? Maybe, but deer didn't move like that. Then, another sound. Something brushing against the nylon of my tent, just near my feet. A light, deliberate touch. Not the wind, not a falling branch, something alive. I stayed still, every muscle frozen in place. My knife was in my pack, just out of reach. My bear spray was closer, but if I moved now, I would give myself away. I needed to wait. Minutes passed. The night stretched on. Then the footsteps started again, moving away this time, slow and steady, disappearing into the trees. I didn't move. I lay there, listening until I was sure the sound was gone. Even then, I stayed awake for hours, staring up at the dark ceiling of my tent, my body tense. The next morning, I unzipped my tent slowly, peering out into the clearing. The sun had just started to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. Everything looked untouched. No signs of an animal, no strange footprints. But I knew what I had heard. I spent the day trying to shake the uneasy feeling. I told myself it had to be an animal, some small predator sniffing around the campsite. I had seen no signs of people this deep in the woods, and the rational part of my mind insisted I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. I forced myself to push the fear down, to focus on enjoying the trip. That night, I built my fire bigger. The light flickered against the trees, creating moving shadows that danced across the clearing. I sat by the flames, listening to the sounds of the night, trying to convince myself everything was normal. Then, Just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were further away, moving through the underbrush beyond the light of the fire. I sat up straight, my heart pounding. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle so hard my knuckles ached. The steps were slow, steady, circling the clearing. I stared into the dark forest, my pulse hammering in my ears. The fire crackled beside me, casting flickering light just far enough to make out the shapes of trees. I saw nothing. Then the sound stopped. Silence. I stayed awake all night, barely moving, gripping my knife with white knuckles. The footsteps never returned, but the feeling of being watched never left. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was already packing. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my gear into my pack, my breath coming fast. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to get out. The hike back felt twice as long. Every rustle of leaves, every shifting shadow had my nerves on edge. I pushed myself hard, moving faster than I should have, barely stopping for water. By the time I reached my car, my legs were burning with exhaustion. I threw my pack into the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors before even starting the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away. I still don't know what was out there those nights. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was something else. But I know one thing for sure. I won't be camping alone again. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I wanted somewhere remote, away from crowds, where I could hike during the day and camp in peace at night. I found a spot deep in the national forest, far from any maintained campsites. It wasn't on any official trail, just a small clearing near a creek that I had marked on a topo map. It looked perfect. I loaded up my truck, packed enough food for 3 nights, and drove out early in the morning. The last stretch was rough, miles of dirt road with potholes big enough to swallow a tire. I finally reached the trailhead where I planned to park. There were no other cars. That was a good sign. I wanted solitude. I hiked in with a heavy pack, following a faint game trail that wound through thick trees. The forest was dense, old growth, with towering pines and underbrush so thick in places that I had to push through it. The only sounds were my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of squirrels or birds. After a couple of hours, I reached the clearing by the creek. It was perfect. Flat ground, plenty of space for my tent, and a good supply of firewood nearby. The creek was shallow but clean, clear water running over smooth stones. I set up camp, pitched my tent, and gathered wood for a fire. The sun was still high, so I took a short hike up a ridge to get a view of the land. The forest stretched for miles in every direction. No roads, no houses, no sign of human activity. It was exactly what I had wanted. As the sun lowered, I cooked a quick meal over the fire. The sky turned a deep orange before fading into dark blue. The air cooled fast. I sat by the fire for a while, just enjoying the quiet. No cars, no voices, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then I heard something. It was faint but distinct. A branch breaking. Not close, but not far either. Maybe 100 yards into the trees. I tensed up, listening. The forest was full of animals, deer, raccoons, maybe a bear. It was nothing to worry about. Still, something about it felt off. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal moving through the underbrush. It was a single, deliberate snap, like someone stepping on a dry branch. Then silence. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. The fire popped, making me flinch. I told myself it was just the forest settling for the night, but I couldn't shake the unease. I scanned the tree line. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that, everything was just shadows. The darkness between the trees felt thicker than it should have. I decided to let the fire burn down and turn in for the night. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay there listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Usually, there were insects, distant calls of night birds, the occasional rustling of small creatures. But now, nothing, just stillness. I lay there for what felt like an hour, staring at the roof of the tent. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard it again. A branch breaking, closer this time, maybe 50 yards away. I held my breath, My heart pounded in my chest. Then another step. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. I felt frozen, every muscle locked up. The steps moved again, circling wide around the clearing. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it. Whoever it was, they were moving carefully, staying just beyond the reach of the dying firelight. Watching, I slid my hand toward my knife, gripping it tightly. My other hand found my headlamp, but I didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. The steps continued, slow and measured. Then they stopped. Silence. I lay there, barely breathing, listening so hard my ears hurt. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, just as I was beginning to think whoever it was had left, I heard the faintest sound. Breathing, not mine, outside the tent. Right behind me, the fabric barely separated us. Just thin nylon. My grip tightened on the knife. I thought about unzipping the tent and lunging out, but I didn't know what I was up against. The breathing stayed for what felt like forever. Then it stopped. The silence was worse. I stayed completely still, waiting. My mind raced. Then I heard footsteps again. Slow, steady, moving away. I waited until they faded into the distance. Then longer still. My legs felt numb from lying so still. My fingers ached from gripping the knife. When I was sure they were gone, I slowly unzipped the tent. The fire had burned down to embers. The forest was still empty. I scanned the tree line with my headlamp. Nothing, but I felt watched. I made a decision. I packed up fast, throwing my gear together without caring about neatness. My hands shook as I worked. Every second felt too long. I hoisted my pack and started moving. I didn't run, but I didn't waste time either. I kept my headlamp off, moving by memory, keeping my steps quiet. The hike back felt endless. Every sound made my skin crawl. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. I reached my truck just as dawn was breaking. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. The sound of it roaring to life was the best thing I'd ever heard. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I still don't know who was out there. A hunter? Some off-the-grid hermit? Something worse? All I know is they watched me for hours, moving just close enough to let me know they were there. And they never said a word. I set up camp near a river, far from any main road or maintained trails. It was the kind of place where people rarely went, too far off the beaten path for casual hikers, too isolated for most campers. That was exactly why I liked it. I had my dog with me, a big German shepherd who never left my side. It was late September, the air cooling at night, the first hints of fall creeping into the trees. I had parked my truck a few miles away and hiked in with everything I needed for the weekend: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, a small stove. The spot I chose was near a bend in the river, where the water pooled deep and slow, perfect for fishing. Thick trees formed a natural barrier around the clearing, giving it a closed-in feeling, but I liked the solitude. The first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon fishing, catching just enough to cook over the fire as the sun went down. My dog stayed close, ears perking at every little sound in the woods. It was quiet out here, no distant hum of traffic, no voices carrying on the wind, just the rush of the river and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. As night fell, I built a fire and sat beside it, watching the flames flicker. My dog lay stretched out next to me, his head resting on his paws but his ears still twitching at every noise. It was peaceful in that way only the deep woods could be. No artificial lights, no distractions, just the sounds of nature settling in for the night. I climbed into my tent sometime after midnight, zipping up the flap, leaving my boots just outside. My dog curled up beside me, his body warm against my legs. I drifted off easily, the exhaustion of the long hike catching up with me. Sometime later, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned down to embers, barely giving off any light. The forest was still too still. My dog was awake, his head up, ears perked. I could feel the tension in his body, the way his breathing had changed. I held still, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not an animal, not the shuffle of something moving through the underbrush, but slow, deliberate footsteps. Close, too close. I stayed frozen, my hand gripping the handle of my knife. My dog let out a low, warning growl. The footsteps stopped. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and controlled. My heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I waited. Nothing. No movement, no sound. The woods were silent again. I let out a slow breath and reached for the zipper of my tent, moving as quietly as possible. My dog stayed tense, his body pressed against the fabric. I unzipped the tent just enough to see outside. The embers of the fire barely cast any light, but I could make out the trees, the river glinting in the moonlight. No movement. Then my dog lunged. He shot out of the tent, barking, snarling, running straight toward the tree line. I scrambled out after him, grabbing my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing. I called him back, my voice steady but firm. He circled near the trees, barking, his body rigid with tension. I kept the flashlight moving, scanning the woods, but I saw nothing. Eventually, he came back, still stiff-legged, still uneasy. I didn't see anything out there, but that didn't mean nothing was there. I didn't go back inside the tent. Instead, I sat by the fire, feeding it more wood, letting the flames grow taller, brighter. My dog sat next to me, ears still twitching, his eyes locked on the dark woods. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed up camp. I didn't want to leave so soon, but my gut told me to go. As I shouldered my pack and started toward the trail, I saw them. Footprints. Large, human footprints pressed into the dirt near the edge of the clearing, right where my dog had charged the night before. They weren't mine. They weren't fresh either. The edges had softened, meaning whoever had made them had been there for a while before I'd even arrived. Watching, I hiked out without stopping, my dog staying close, never once looking back. I didn't hear anything behind me, but I felt it. That sense of being watched, followed. I didn't relax until I was back at my truck, the door shut, the engine running. I never went back to that spot. Some places aren't meant to be visited twice. I had planned the trip for weeks. Just me, my pack, and a few days deep in the woods, away from everything. I wanted solitude, quiet, the kind of space where my thoughts could wander without the constant noise of everyday life pressing in. I picked a spot miles from the nearest road, a place I had marked on an old topo map years ago but had never actually visited. It was the kind of place I liked, far enough off the beaten path that I wouldn't run into anyone, isolated enough to feel like I had the world to myself. The hike in was tough but rewarding. The trailhead was nothing more than a widening in the dirt road, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. From there, I followed a faint, overgrown path that wound through dense trees, climbed a steep ridge, then dropped down into a deep valley where a narrow creek cut through the forest floor. I had to cross it twice, stepping carefully on slick rocks, before finally reaching the small clearing I had chosen. It was perfect, a flat stretch of ground just large enough for my tent, surrounded by thick pine and aspen. The creek ran nearby, its water clear and cold. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. There were no signs that anyone had camped here recently, no fire rings, no trash, just the woods, quiet and undisturbed. I set up camp, took my time gathering wood for a small fire, then settled in to enjoy the evening. As the sun dipped lower, the forest around me darkened, the long shadows stretching between the trees. I ate a quick meal, drank from my water bottle, and stretched out near the fire, letting the warmth soak into my skin. The first night was uneventful. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're physically exhausted and far from the distractions of everyday life. I woke early, made coffee over the fire, and spent the day exploring the valley. I followed the creek downstream for a while, then climbed up the ridge to get a better look at the land. The trees were thick, the underbrush dense in places, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just endless stretches of forest, untouched and quiet. It wasn't until I started heading back to camp that I noticed something strange. The first thing that caught my attention was a small pile of rocks near the edge of the clearing. I hadn't put them there. 3 stones stacked neatly, right at the base of a tree. They weren't there that morning. I frowned, studying them. Maybe I had missed them before. Maybe they had been there all along, and I just hadn't noticed. But as I looked closer, I saw something else. Footprints. Not mine. They were faint, pressed into the soft earth near the creek, leading toward my camp. Barefoot, I felt a tightness in my chest, an instinctual unease curling at the edges of my mind. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. No reason for someone to be walking around barefoot. I crouched down, studying the prints. The size was strange, too large for a child, too narrow for most men. The toes were long, almost claw-like. I straightened, scanning the trees, listening. The forest was still. No wind, no birds, just the distant trickle of water in the creek. I forced myself to shake it off, told myself I was overreacting. Maybe an animal had left the tracks. Maybe the rocks were just a coincidence. I didn't want to let paranoia get the best of me. But that night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound outside. Soft, almost rhythmic. Breathing, not mine. I stayed still, listening, my pulse hammering in my ears. The fire had burned low, casting only the faintest glow against the tent walls. The sound came again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate inhale, then a pause, then another. I forced myself to move as quietly as possible. Reaching for the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag, my fingers wrapped around the handle, the metal cold against my palm. I held my breath, waiting, then silence. The breathing stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of my own heart. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. In the morning, I found more footprints, closer this time, circling my camp. The ground was disturbed near the fire, as if something had crouched there, watching me. The stacked stones were gone. In their place, a single, larger rock sat in the exact center of the clearing. A warning. I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't bother with breakfast, didn't take my usual care in making sure the fire was completely out. I just wanted to get out. The hike back felt longer than it should have. The forest pressed in on me, the trees too close, the silence too deep. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the undergrowth, my breath coming fast and shallow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I made it back to my truck just as the first raindrops started to fall. I threw my gear in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, tall, thin, barefoot, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove, faster than I should have, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who or what was out there. But I do know one thing: I won't be going back. I had been camping alone for years. It was my way of getting away from everything, a chance to reset. I knew how to be careful, how to plan ahead. I always told someone where I was going, packed extra supplies, and trusted my instincts. I had never been the type to let my imagination get the best of me. But there are some things you can't prepare for, no matter how experienced you think you are. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, far enough from any roads that I wouldn't hear passing cars, far enough from any popular trails that I wouldn't run into other campers. It was just how I liked it. Quiet, secluded, peaceful. The first day went exactly as planned. I hiked in, set up my tent in a small clearing, and gathered enough firewood to last the night. The air was cool but not cold, and the wind moved gently through the trees. It felt like the kind of night that would be easy to sleep through. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal, and listened to the sounds of the woods around me. It wasn't until I was getting ready to crawl into my tent that I noticed something that put me on edge. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now, and I was using my headlamp to find my way to the tent when I saw something on the ground that hadn't been there before. A footprint, not mine. It was fresh. The edges were sharp, the soil still damp where it had been pressed down. I stood there, staring at it, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It wasn't the print of a boot, more like a bare foot, but too large, the shape slightly off. I turned in a slow circle, shining my light across the clearing. Nothing, just the trees and the dark beyond them. I told myself it was an old print, left behind by another camper, and I just hadn't noticed it before. But I didn't believe it. I had chosen this spot carefully. There had been no signs of recent activity when I arrived. And why would someone be walking around barefoot this deep in the woods? I forced myself into my tent, zipping it shut tight. I kept my knife close, along with the hatchet I had used for splitting wood. Every noise outside seemed louder than before, every rustling branch, every snapping twig, but nothing came closer. After a long while, exhaustion won over my nerves, and I finally drifted off. I woke up to movement, something outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I listened, every muscle in my body tensed. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too slow, too steady. They moved around the campsite, circling. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. I held my breath, waiting. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I gripped the knife tighter, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing. A long, terrible silence stretched out. Then the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. It wasn't mine. I felt frozen in place, my mind racing through possibilities. A lost hiker? A hunter? Someone playing a prank? But I knew deep down that none of those explanations made sense. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but my voice wouldn't come. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the footsteps moved away. I listened as they faded into the woods, swallowed by the trees. I didn't move. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, gripping my knife, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. By the time the first light of dawn touched the trees, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my camp as fast as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The woods were quiet, the same as they had been when I arrived. But the feeling hadn't left me, that sense of being watched, of something just out of sight. I hiked out faster than I had planned, not stopping to rest. When I finally reached my car, I felt the tension in my chest ease, but not completely. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in cell service, that I let myself breathe. I never saw who or what was out there that night. I don't think I want to, but I do know one thing. I won't be camping alone again. I had been planning the trip for months, a solo camping trip deep into the backcountry, miles from any roads or marked trails. I wanted real solitude, the kind you can't find at established campgrounds or near popular hiking spots. I wanted to be alone in the wild, relying on nothing but my gear and my experience. I had mapped out a route that would take me through thick forests, over ridges, and down into a remote valley where I planned to set up camp near a small creek. The hike in was rougher than I expected. The trail disappeared after a few miles, and I had to navigate by map and compass, pushing through dense undergrowth, climbing over fallen trees, and picking my way across rocky slopes. My pack felt heavier with each mile, and by the time I reached the valley, my legs were aching and my shoulders were sore. The spot was perfect, a flat area near the creek, surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. The water was clear and cold, and there were plenty of downed branches for firewood. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun dipped below the ridgeline, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of the forest changed. Birds quieted, replaced by the distant hoot of an owl and the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, feeling the deep sense of peace that only comes from being truly alone in the wilderness. No cell service, no human voices, just the crackling fire and the whispering wind in the trees. Then I heard something, a sound just on the edge of hearing, a faint snap like a twig breaking. I turned my head, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees stood still, their trunks black against the fading light of the sky, probably just an animal, a deer or a raccoon. I listened for a few more minutes, but there was nothing else. The fire popped, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I banked the fire and climbed into my tent, zipping it shut. My sleeping bag was warm, and the exhaustion of the long hike settled into my bones. The sounds of the forest faded into the background as I drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. My breath was slow, my body still half asleep. Then I heard it again. A footstep, not an animal, not the random sounds of the forest. A distinct, deliberate footstep in the leaves just outside my tent. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. My ears strained for any other sound, my heart hammering in my chest. Then another step, closer. I reached slowly for the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag, my fingers wrapping around the handle. I held my breath, listening. The fire had died down to embers, casting only the faintest glow outside the tent. The darkness beyond was absolute. Then the sound of movement, more footsteps circling the tent. Slow, deliberate. My mind raced. A bear? A mountain lion? But no, the steps were too steady, too controlled. Not an animal. Someone was out there, moving around my camp in the middle of the night. I stayed as still as possible, gripping the knife tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched on, so long that I started to think maybe I had imagined it, that my half-asleep brain had turned the normal sounds of the forest into something sinister. Then, just outside the tent, inches from where I lay, a deep, slow exhale. I nearly stopped breathing. Someone was standing right there, just outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from the night. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The breathing was steady, measured. Then another step, the faintest rustle of fabric, as if someone was leaning closer. Then silence. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, my muscles aching from staying so still. Eventually, the night sounds returned. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the wind, but nothing else. No more footsteps, no more breathing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn touched the trees, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peered outside. The fire was nothing but cold ashes. The forest was still and empty, but there were footprints, human footprints circling my tent. They weren't mine. They were too large, too deep, and they didn't come from any trail. They came from the forest, and they never led away. I set out early that morning, driving for hours until the paved roads turned to dirt, and then farther still until the only thing around me was miles of forest and empty land. The plan was to camp for a few nights in a place where no one else would be, just me, my gear, and the quiet of the wilderness. I liked it that way. The spot I picked was near a slow-moving river, surrounded by thick trees. I parked my truck a good distance away and hiked in, carrying everything I needed on my back. The hike itself was uneventful, just the usual sounds of the woods, birds overhead, the occasional rustling in the brush. By late afternoon, I had set up my tent, gathered firewood, and had water boiling for a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped and the forest shifted. Daytime sounds faded, replaced by the distant call of an owl, the occasional snapping of a branch. I sat by the fire, eating and watching the flames flicker. Then, I noticed something odd. The woods had gone completely silent. No wind, no insects, no usual background noise. Just stillness. I listened, waiting for it to pass, but it didn't. It stretched on, like something had pressed pause on the entire forest. I tried to shake it off, but that feeling of being watched crept up my spine. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the way the dark can make everything feel closer than it really is. but I still kept my knife close when I climbed into my tent that night. Sometime later, I woke up. A sound had pulled me from sleep, something distinct against the usual nighttime noises. It was slow, deliberate movement, somewhere just outside my tent. My body went rigid as I listened. The steps were heavy, crunching against the forest floor, moving around my campsite. Not an animal. Not the light, quick steps of a deer or the skittering of a raccoon. Something bigger. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, knife in hand. The steps moved closer. Then they stopped right outside my tent. A shadow shifted against the fabric, blocking out what little moonlight filtered through the trees. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then the steps moved away, slow, deliberate, back into the trees. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening, waiting. Nothing else happened. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent carefully, stepping out into the crisp air. My fire had burned down to embers. Everything looked untouched, but the tracks were there. Large boot prints in the dirt, circling my tent, leading off into the trees. I wasn't alone out there. Someone had found me. I packed up fast, moving quickly, keeping my knife in hand. I hiked back to my truck, every sound in the woods putting me on edge. I didn't know if I was being followed, but I didn't take any chances. I threw my gear in the truck, got in, and drove. I didn't stop until I was back on pavement, until the miles of dirt road were behind me. I never went back to that spot. Never wanted to know who had been out there watching me. I still camp alone, but now I'm always armed, and I never let my guard down. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It was late September, just cool enough at night to need a jacket, but the days were still warm, and the leaves were starting to turn. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, a place I had marked months ago on a map after reading about it in an old hiking forum. Supposedly, hardly anyone went out there. It was about 5 miles from the nearest trailhead, off an unmaintained spur that led down to a creek. Perfectly secluded. I packed light, one-man tent, sleeping bag rated for cold, some dried food, a camp stove, a headlamp, and my knife. I always carried a knife just in case. I also had my small collapsible saw and a hatchet for firewood. I didn't bring a firearm this time, though I had debated it. But I'd camped in remote areas plenty of times before and never needed one. The hike in was beautiful. The trail was narrow and overgrown in spots, winding through thick trees with little clearings where the sun filtered through in golden patches. I followed the map carefully, checking my compass every so often to make sure I was on track. About 3 hours in, I found the spur leading toward the creek. It was even less maintained than I expected, barely a footpath, but I followed it down, pushing through the brush until I finally broke into a clearing beside the water. The campsite was perfect, a flat patch of dirt under a thick stand of pines, with the creek bubbling just a few yards away. The sound of the water was constant, soothing. There were no signs of recent campers, no old fire rings, no trash, nothing. It was exactly the kind of place I liked, isolated. I set up my tent quickly, unpacked my food, and gathered some wood. The area was damp, but I found enough dry branches under the thick trees to get a small fire going. As the sun set, I ate my dinner by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual things, the occasional rustle of leaves, a distant owl, the crack of a branch somewhere in the distance, probably from a deer moving through. As night fell, the woods got darker than I expected. The thick trees blocked out most of the moonlight. My fire cast a small bubble of light, but beyond that was just blackness. I had camped alone plenty of times before, but something about that particular night felt different. Maybe it was just the way the trees loomed so close, or the way the creek made it hard to hear anything moving in the distance. Either way, I felt more on edge than usual, but I shook it off. I was just tired from the hike. I turned in early. I had a long day ahead of me, planning to explore further up the creek in the morning. I zipped myself into my tent, adjusting my sleeping bag, listening to the fire crackle outside. I left the rain fly off so I could see the stars if I woke up in the night. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire was nearly out, just a faint orange glow in the ashes. The creek was still rushing along, steady as before, but something was off. I lay there trying to figure it out. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves. Not the random rustling of wind or a small animal moving. It was slow, purposeful, close. My breath caught in my throat. I lay completely still, my ears straining. Another step, closer this time. I slowly reached for my headlamp and knife, my fingers wrapping around the handle, my thumb resting on the switch. Then silence. I waited. 10 seconds, 20, full minute. Nothing, just the sound of the creek. I flicked the headlamp on. The bright beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees outside my tent. Nothing there. I shined the light around the clearing, across the fire pit, toward the edge of the woods. No movement, no eyes reflecting back at me. I listened for a while longer, but there was nothing, just my own breathing, too loud in my ears. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, or maybe a deer moving through. It was common enough. I turned the headlamp off and lay back down, still gripping the knife, forcing myself to relax. It took a long time to fall asleep again. I woke just before dawn. The sky was a dull gray, the first light barely reaching through the trees. The fire was completely dead, just a pile of cold ash. I climbed out of the tent, stretching, shaking off the stiffness from a night of uneasy sleep. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were just outside my tent, pressed into the damp earth. Deep, heavy. They led from the trees to the edge of the fire pit, then toward my tent. The closest was less than 2 feet from where I had been sleeping. I scanned the area, my heart pounding. Whoever had been here hadn't left any other signs. No trash, no disturbed branches, nothing. Just the prints, clear as day in the dirt. I packed up fast, faster than I ever had before. I didn't even eat. I just shoved everything into my bag, doused the fire pit, and threw my pack on. My skin crawled as I hiked back up the spur, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The whole way back to the trailhead, I felt like I was being watched. Couldn't shake it. The feeling didn't leave me until I was back in my truck, locked inside, engine running, miles away from the forest. I still don't know who was out there that night. I don't know why they were watching or what they wanted, but I do know one thing for sure. They were close enough to touch my tent, and I never heard them leave. The road to the trailhead was a mess of washouts and potholes, the kind of gravel path that could shake a car apart if you weren't careful. I had picked a remote site, far from any busy campgrounds or RV hookups, the kind of place where you didn't see another person for days. That was the appeal. Solitude, quiet, just me and the wilderness. I needed the break. Work had been relentless, and the constant hum of people, of traffic, of screens, had left me stretched thin. I parked at the dead end of the road, where a faded wooden sign marked the start of the trail. The trees loomed tall and close, swallowing most of the afternoon light. I checked my pack, adjusting the straps, double-checking my food supply and water. It was a long hike in, nearly 9 miles to the spot I had chosen on the map. A small clearing near a creek, tucked between a ridgeline and a deep stretch of old-growth forest. The trail started off easy, a steady incline winding through pines and firs, the scent of warm needles thick in the still air. I moved at a good pace, keeping an eye on the light, knowing I had only a few hours to make camp before dark. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No road noise, no distant hum of planes overhead. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, the chirp of birds, the snap of a branch underfoot. About 4 miles in, I spotted something that made me slow down. A campsite, or what was left of one. A fire ring of blackened stones, half covered in moss. A tattered blue tarp, collapsed and rotting, caught in the underbrush. No tent, no gear, just the remains of a long-abandoned setup. I stepped closer, scanning the ground. Nothing recent. The site had been left to the elements for years. Still, it unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite place. Something about the way the tarp had collapsed, the way the fire ring looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of use. I shook it off and kept moving. People left campsites behind all the time, whether from bad weather or poor planning. It wasn't unusual. By the time I reached my chosen spot, the sun was dipping low. The clearing was perfect. A flat patch of earth nestled beside a narrow creek, sheltered by towering firs. I set up my tent, stowed my food in a bear bag and hung it from a high branch, then settled in to eat. The fire crackled low as I stretched out, listening to the night sounds pick up. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft burble of the creek. Then something else. A branch snapped. Close, too close. I froze, my hand halfway to my water bottle. It wasn't the sharp, quick snap of something small. It was deliberate, weighty. I turned slowly, scanning the dark beyond the firelight. Nothing moved, just trees, the shifting shadows cast by the flickering flames. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon nosing through the underbrush, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. I banked the fire low, not wanting to draw too much attention, and crawled into my tent. I kept my knife close, my headlamp within reach. Sleep was uneasy. Every little sound jolted me awake, my heart hammering. The wind picked up around midnight, rattling the branches overhead. At some point, I must have drifted off because when I woke, it was to silence. Not normal silence. Heavy, complete. The kind of silence that didn't belong in the woods. No wind, no insects, no night sounds. Just stillness. I didn't move. I just lay there, barely breathing, ears straining. Then, from somewhere in the trees, I heard it. A whistle. Not a bird. Not the high, sharp call of something natural. This was deliberate, controlled. 2 notes rising, then falling. My skin went cold. I waited. Nothing. Then, after what felt like forever, another whistle. Closer. I sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. I reached for my headlamp, clicking it on, aiming the beam at the trees. The underbrush was thick, dense with ferns and brambles. The light caught movement, just a shift of shadow, a shape too tall to be an animal. I yanked the zipper down, stepping out of the tent, my knife gripped tight in one hand. My breath plumed in the cold air. The trees stood still. Nothing moved. But I knew, deep in my gut, that someone was out there. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire, stoking it back to life, watching the trees, waiting for the first light of dawn. By morning, the forest had returned to normal. The birds called, the wind rustled the leaves, the creek hummed along. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all night. I packed up fast. I wasn't staying another night. I doused the fire, strapped on my pack, and started back down the trail. The hike out felt longer, every rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. Then, about 3 miles in, I saw something that stopped me cold. A boot print, not mine, fresh, deep in the mud, right in the middle of the trail. Someone had been behind me, following. I didn't stop after that. Didn't take breaks, didn't look back. Just pushed forward, as fast as I could, until I saw the break in the trees where my car was parked. I tossed my pack in the back, slid behind the wheel, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, someone was standing there, watching. I didn't stop. I parked my truck at the edge of the dirt road, just where the tree line thickened and the undergrowth started to take over. This was as far as the road went. Beyond this point, it was just forest, untouched and wild. I had found the spot on a map, an isolated stretch of land near a river, miles away from the nearest town. It was perfect. No people, no noise, just me and the woods. I grabbed my pack from the truck bed, slinging it over my shoulders, and double-checked my gear. I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, extra clothes, a first aid kit, and my knife strapped to my belt. I had been on plenty of solo trips before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the remoteness, the fact that I had driven so far out of my way just to get here. It wasn't a designated campsite. There were no trails leading in or out. If something happened, I was on my own. The hike in was rough. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks, making each step deliberate. I moved carefully, stepping over fallen branches and pushing through thick brush. The air was damp, carrying the scent of earth and leaves, and the deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Took me over an hour to reach the river. The water was slow-moving, dark and wide, bordered by thick trees that leaned over the banks, their roots exposed like skeletal fingers grasping at the dirt. I found a clearing not far from the water and set up camp. The ground was soft but dry, perfect for my tent. I cleared away some sticks and leaves, then unrolled my gear, hammering the stakes into the ground until everything was secure. By the time I had a fire going, the sun was sinking behind the trees. The light faded fast, shadows stretching long across the ground. I cooked a simple meal over the flames, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the stillness. It should have been peaceful, but something gnawed at the back of my mind, a feeling I couldn't shake, the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The first sign that something wasn't right came just after dark. I was sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance, when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, distant but deliberate, footsteps, not the quick, erratic scurrying of an animal, but something heavier, something moving with purpose. I froze, listening. The sound was faint, coming from deeper in the woods, beyond the tree line. I strained my ears, trying to pick up anything else. Breathing, twigs snapping, movement, but after a few seconds, the noise stopped. The woods fell silent again. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me in the quiet. I had been alone long enough to know how easy it was for the brain to fill in the gaps, to make things seem worse than they were. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease creeping into my gut. I banked the fire low and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I laid in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling, ears tuned to the silence outside. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was close, too close. A slow, steady inhale, followed by an exhale, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. My body went rigid, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just listened. The breathing continued deep and measured like whoever or whatever it was standing right outside my tent, listening just as intently as I was. I could hear the slight shift of weight, the creak of branches underfoot. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I lay there, every muscle locked in place, waiting. The silence stretched on, pressing against me like a weight. I counted the seconds in my head. 10, 20, full minute, nothing. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the knife strapped to my belt. My fingers closed around the handle, grip tightening. I didn't move the zipper, didn't make a sound. I just stayed there, knife in hand, waiting for any sign of movement outside. But there was nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Every tiny rustle, every distant snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows against the trees. I didn't know what had been out there, but I wasn't about to let my guard down again. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped outside. The air was cold, the ground damp with morning dew. I scanned the area around my campsite, looking for tracks, for any sign that something or someone had been there. And that's when I saw them. Footprints, large, unmistakable. They circled my tent, weaving through the clearing before disappearing back into the woods. I crouched down, examining them closely. The dirt was disturbed, the impressions deep. Whoever it was had been standing there for a long time, watching. A chill ran down my spine. I had camped in the wilderness dozens of times, and I had never felt the urge to pack up and leave so fast. I threw my gear together, stuffing everything into my pack with shaking hands. I doused the fire, kicking dirt over the last glowing embers, and shouldered my bag. I didn't look back as I started the hike out. I kept my knife in hand, my pace quick and steady. The forest felt different now. The trees loomed taller, the shadows darker. Every step felt like something was just behind me, watching, waiting. I reached my truck and threw my pack in the back, my hands unsteady as I yanked open the door and climbed inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out of there, gravel spitting from under the tires. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. A figure stood at the tree line, just beyond where the woods met the road. Too far to make out a face, too still to be anything but human. Watching, I pressed the gas pedal harder and didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that spot, never told anyone about what happened. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear it, the breathing, right outside my door. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A weekend alone in the woods, just me, my tent, and the quiet. I had picked a remote campsite in the national forest, well away from any roads or established campgrounds. The kind of place where you wouldn't see another person for days. That was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. I arrived in the early afternoon, parked my truck at a small pull-off, and hiked in about 3 miles with my gear. The trail was overgrown, not well marked, but I had studied the map beforehand and felt confident about where I was going. By the time I found a decent clearing near a slow-moving creek, the sun was already dropping lower in the sky. It was a perfect spot. Flat, dry, surrounded by thick trees for wind cover, and just far enough from the water to avoid any unwanted nighttime visitors looking for a drink. Setting up camp took about an hour. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going as the sun dipped behind the trees. It was one of those crisp autumn evenings, where the air cools fast the moment the sun disappears. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal, and listened to the sounds of the forest. No cars, no voices, no artificial noise. Just the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional rustling in the brush, and the soft trickle of the creek. The first thing that felt off was the silence. Not right away, but after the fire had burned down to embers and the forest should have been alive with nighttime sounds. Instead, it felt empty. I didn't hear any insects, no wind moving through the trees, nothing, just an unnatural stillness. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of unease stuck. When I finally crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and shut my eyes, I figured I'd feel better in the morning. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something outside. Each time I held my breath, listening, but there was nothing.
No footsteps, no rustling, no breathing.
Just silence. It wasn't until well past midnight that exhaustion finally pulled me under. Sometime later, I woke up to a sound. A single, deliberate sound. A twig snapping. Close. Too close. I held my breath. My mind went straight to animals, a deer, maybe a raccoon. But something felt off. Deer move constantly, light-footed, rustling through the underbrush. This was different. One sound, then nothing. Like someone had stepped on a branch and then gone still. Listening, watching. I stayed frozen, ears straining for any sign of movement. Then I heard it again. Another step, closer. I forced myself to breathe slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound. My rifle was outside, leaned against a tree. My knife was buried in my backpack. All I had in arm's reach was a small flashlight. I didn't move. I just waited. Then came the breathing. Shallow, slow, just beyond the thin wall of my tent. Not an animal's breath. Too controlled. Too human. Panic set in. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. I hadn't seen a single person on my hike in. No signs of recent campers, no distant sounds of voices. Whoever was out there, they weren't lost. They weren't wandering through by accident. They had found me specifically in the middle of nowhere, and they were standing just feet from my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just waited, heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. Then, after what felt like forever, the breathing stopped. Silence again. I stayed like that for over an hour, unmoving, waiting for another sound. But nothing came. No retreating footsteps, no more snapped twigs. Whoever had been there was either gone, or worse, still standing outside, completely still, just listening. At some point, exhaustion won. My body shut down, even as my mind screamed to stay alert. When I opened my eyes again, dawn was breaking. The inside of my tent was bathed in pale gray light. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. Silence. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My breath caught. Footprints, dozens of them, surrounding my campsite in a wide, deliberate circle. They weren't mine. The tracks led in from the woods, stopping just feet from my tent. No sign of them walking away, just standing there, watching. I didn't pack up. I didn't eat. I didn't even put the fire out properly. I grabbed my essentials, left most of my gear behind, and started hiking out as fast as I could. The entire hike back, I felt watched. The same silence pressed in around me, suffocating. The feeling didn't leave me until I reached my truck, threw my pack inside, and locked the doors. I drove for miles before I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. When I got home, I tried to tell myself I had overreacted. Maybe the footprints had been there before and I hadn't noticed. Maybe the sounds had been a deer, a coyote, some normal forest creature. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't true. I still don't know who was out there that night, what they wanted, why they stood so still, so silent, for so long. But I do know one thing: I won't be camping alone again. The road was worse than I expected. I had known it would be bad. Unpaved, rutted out from the snowmelt in spring, but I hadn't thought it would feel this remote. My tires slid in loose gravel, the suspension rocking me back and forth as I wound my way up toward the cabin. The trees pressed in close on both sides, thick with undergrowth, the kind of forest that swallowed the last traces of daylight long before the sun actually set. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a break from everything. I had rented a small off-grid cabin deep in the woods, miles from any town, with no cell service and no electricity. That was the appeal. Just me, my thoughts, and the quiet. I had brought a book, some food, and a lantern. The place had a wood stove, a hand pump for water, and an outhouse out back. Simple, but comfortable enough for a few nights. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had sunk below the treeline, casting long, deep shadows across the clearing. The structure itself was older than I had expected. The listing had made it sound like a rustic but well-maintained getaway, but the reality was a sagging roof, faded wood, and a front door that looked like it had been rehung at least a dozen times. Still, it was standing, and it was mine for the next 3 nights. I parked, stretched my legs, and unloaded my gear. The air was still, and the forest was strangely quiet. No wind, no birds, no distant rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Just the crunch of my boots against the dirt and the creak of the porch as I stepped up to the door. The key was under a loose board, exactly where the owner had said it would be. The lock turned stiffly, but the door swung open without much resistance. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood, dust, and the faintest trace of something musty. The furniture was simple. A wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, a narrow cot against the far wall. The wood stove sat in one corner, a pile of firewood stacked beside it. Shelves lined the walls, empty except for a few abandoned jars and a dented metal coffee pot. There were no curtains on the windows, just bare glass reflecting the last of the light outside. I set up my things, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and lit the lantern as the darkness pressed in. The silence felt heavier now. I had grown up camping, used to the sounds of the wilderness at night. The chirp of insects, the rustle of nocturnal creatures going about their business. But here there was nothing, just the crackle of the lantern and my own breathing. I ate a quick dinner, read a few pages of my book, and tried to shake the feeling creeping up the back of my neck. It wasn't fear, not exactly. Just an awareness, like I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. I convinced myself it was the unfamiliar setting, the isolation playing tricks on me. I double-checked the door lock, banked the fire in the stove, and climbed into my sleeping bag. The cot was stiff, and every movement made it groan beneath me. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening. It must have been close to midnight when I first heard it. A soft sound, almost indistinguishable from the silence. A shift of weight on the porch, the faintest creak of a wooden board. My skin prickled. I held my breath, straining to hear past the pounding in my chest. Another sound, this one lower. A slow, deliberate movement against the outside wall, like something or someone brushing past the cabin. I sat up carefully, the lantern's glow throwing flickering shadows against the walls. The windows were dark, just black squares cut into the cabin. I thought about calling out, but my throat felt tight. Instead, I reached for the hatchet I had brought with me and gripped the handle with both hands. The noise stopped. For a long time, I sat there, every muscle tense. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal. A raccoon, maybe, or a deer nosing around the clearing. I didn't want to be the kind of person who scared themselves over nothing. I forced myself to lie back down, gripping the hatchet under the sleeping bag, and somehow, eventually, I slept. The next morning was overcast, the sky a dull, heavy gray. I stepped onto the porch, rubbing sleep from my eyes, and froze. The ground beneath the steps was disturbed. Not paw prints, not hooves, footsteps, deep ones, pressed into the dirt, circling the cabin. The breath left my lungs in a slow exhale. My first thought was that someone had been messing with me, maybe a local who didn't like outsiders renting the place. But the tracks weren't fresh. The edges had softened, blurred slightly by the dampness of the morning air. Whoever had made them had been here before I arrived. I spent the day trying to shake it off. I hiked a little, sticking close to the cabin, never venturing far enough to lose sight of it. The woods felt different now. Not peaceful, not quiet, just waiting. That night, I kept the hatchet next to me. I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every shifting shadow outside, set my nerves on edge. But nothing happened. The third night, I made a decision. I would leave at first light. I didn't care if it was cutting my trip short. Whatever had made those tracks had been watching that cabin long before I got there, and I had no intention of finding out why. But just before dawn, something woke me up. The front door handle turned. I heard the latch click, the wood groaning as pressure was put against it. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the hatchet, heart slamming against my ribs. The door shuddered, the hinges creaking. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, backing up until my shoulders hit the wall. Then nothing. The handle stopped moving. The cabin went silent again. I stayed frozen in place, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But it never did. When the sun finally started to rise, I forced myself to move. I packed my things in record time, shoving everything into my bag without caring how it fit. When I stepped onto the porch, my stomach clenched. More footprints, fresh this time, leading from the trees to the door. Standing there, waiting, I didn't waste another second. I threw my gear into the car, started the engine, and backed out so fast my tires spit gravel in every direction. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. Didn't check my phone until I had service again. When I finally did, I pulled over, hands shaking, and checked the listing. It was gone. Not marked as unavailable. Not booked by someone else. Just gone. I never found out who had been watching that cabin. I never went back to find out. The road was worse than I expected. I had known it would be bad. Unpaved, rutted out from the snowmelt in spring, but I hadn't thought it would feel this remote. My tires slid in loose gravel, the suspension rocking me back and forth as I wound my way up toward the cabin. The trees pressed in close on both sides, thick with undergrowth, the kind of forest that swallowed the last traces of daylight long before the sun actually set. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a break from everything. I had rented a small off-grid cabin deep in the woods, miles from any town, with no cell service and no electricity. That was the appeal. Just me, my thoughts, and the quiet. I had brought a book, some food, and a lantern. The place had a wood stove, a hand pump for water, and an outhouse out back. Simple, but comfortable enough for a few nights. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had sunk below the treeline, casting long, deep shadows across the clearing. The structure itself was older than I had expected. The listing had made it sound like a rustic but well-maintained getaway, but the reality was a sagging roof, faded wood, and a front door that looked like it had been rehung at least a dozen times. Still, it was standing, and it was mine for the next 3 nights. I parked, stretched my legs, and unloaded my gear. The air was still, and the forest was strangely quiet. No wind, no birds, no distant rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Just the crunch of my boots against the dirt and the creak of the porch as I stepped up to the door. The key was under a loose board, exactly where the owner had said it would be. The lock turned stiffly, but the door swung open without much resistance. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood, dust, and the faintest trace of something musty. The furniture was simple: a wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, a narrow cot against the far wall. The wood stove sat in one corner, a pile of firewood stacked beside it. Shelves lined the walls, empty except for a few abandoned jars and a dented metal coffee pot. There were no curtains on the windows, just bare glass reflecting the last of the light outside. I set up my things, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and lit the lantern as the darkness pressed in. The silence felt heavier now. I had grown up camping, used to the sounds of the wilderness at night, the chirp of insects, the rustle of nocturnal creatures going about their business. But here there was nothing, just the crackle of the lantern and my own breathing. I ate a quick dinner, read a few pages of my book, and tried to shake the feeling creeping up the back of my neck. It wasn't fear, not exactly, just an awareness like I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. I convinced myself it was the unfamiliar setting, the isolation playing tricks on me. I double-checked the door lock, banked the fire in the stove, and climbed into my sleeping bag. The cot was stiff, and every movement made it groan beneath me. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening. It must have been close to midnight when I first heard it. A soft sound, almost indistinguishable from the silence. A shift of weight on the porch, the faintest creak of a wooden board. My skin prickled. I held my breath, straining to hear past the pounding in my chest. Another sound, this one lower. A slow, deliberate movement against the outside wall, like something or someone brushing past the cabin. I sat up carefully, the lantern's glow throwing flickering shadows against the walls. The windows were dark, just black squares cut into the cabin. I thought about calling out, but my throat felt tight. Instead, I reached for the hatchet I had brought with me and gripped the handle with both hands. The noise stopped. For a long time, I sat there, every muscle tense. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal. A raccoon, maybe, or a deer nosing around the clearing. I didn't want to be the kind of person who scared themselves over nothing. I forced myself to lie back down, gripping the hatchet under the sleeping bag, and somehow, eventually, I slept. The next morning was overcast, the sky a dull, heavy gray. I stepped onto the porch, rubbing sleep from my eyes, and froze. The ground beneath the steps was disturbed. Not paw prints, not hooves, footsteps, deep ones, pressed into the dirt, circling the cabin. The breath left my lungs in a slow exhale. My first thought was that someone had been messing with me, maybe a local who didn't like outsiders renting the place. But the tracks weren't fresh. The edges had softened, blurred slightly by the dampness of the morning air. Whoever had made them had been here before I arrived. I spent the day trying to shake it off. I hiked a little, sticking close to the cabin, never venturing far enough to lose sight of it. The woods felt different now. Not peaceful, not quiet, just waiting. That night, I kept the hatchet next to me. I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every shifting shadow outside, set my nerves on edge. But nothing happened. The third night, I made a decision. I would leave at first light. I didn't care if it was cutting my trip short. Whatever had made those tracks had been watching that cabin long before I got there, and I had no intention of finding out why. But just before dawn, something woke me up. The front door handle turned. I heard the latch click, the wood groaning as pressure was put against it. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the hatchet, heart slamming against my ribs. The door shuddered, the hinges creaking. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, backing up until my shoulders hit the wall. Then nothing. The handle stopped moving. The cabin went silent again. I stayed frozen in place, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But it never did. When the sun finally started to rise, I forced myself to move. I packed my things in record time, shoving everything into my bag without caring how it fit. When I stepped onto the porch, my stomach clenched. More footprints, fresh this time, leading from the trees to the door. Standing there, waiting. I didn't waste another second. I threw my gear into the car, started the engine, and backed out so fast my tires spit gravel in every direction. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. Didn't check my phone until I had service again. When I finally did, I pulled over, hands shaking, and checked the listing. It was gone. Not marked as unavailable. Not booked by someone else. Just gone. I never found out who had been watching that cabin. I never went back to find out. I needed to get away. Work had been a nightmare. The city felt like it was closing in on me, and I couldn't remember the last time I had more than a few hours of peace. When my friend offered me his family's old hunting cabin for the weekend, I jumped on it. He said it hadn't been used in a few years, but that everything should still be in working order. He gave me the directions, warned me that cell service would be spotty at best, and told me to enjoy the quiet. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive took me nearly 5 hours. The last hour was on a barely maintained dirt road, winding deeper into the woods. It was the kind of place where you didn't just stumble upon a cabin. You had to know it was there. Trees stretched high on both sides, the road narrowing so much in some places that I had to check twice to make sure I hadn't veered off onto an animal trail. My SUV handled it fine, though I knew I'd have a hell of a time getting out if it rained. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The cabin itself was small, just one story with a wraparound porch. The wood was weathered but solid, and the single window facing the front was covered with heavy shutters. I killed the engine and just sat for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. No cars, no sirens, no distant hum of electricity, just the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of some bird in the distance. I grabbed my bag from the back and made my way up the creaking steps. The key was exactly where my friend said it would be, tucked under a loose board by the door. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the air inside carrying the unmistakable scent of old wood, dust, and time. The interior was simple. A main room with a wood stove, a sagging couch, and a tiny kitchen with a propane burner. A single door led to a bedroom with a cot and a thick wool blanket folded neatly at the foot. The bathroom was nothing more than an outhouse a few yards behind the cabin, half hidden by the trees. Rustic, but more than enough for a weekend of solitude. I set my bag down, opened the windows to air the place out, and got to work. I started a fire in the wood stove, boiled some water for coffee, and sat out on the porch while the last of the light drained from the sky. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd needed. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The quiet was a blanket, wrapping around me, pressing me down into the cot. When I woke up in the morning, the sun was already cutting through the trees, and I felt lighter than I had in a long time. I spent most of the day hiking, following old deer trails, losing myself in the stillness. I found a small stream, icy cold and clear as glass, and sat beside it for what must have been hours. By the time I made it back to the cabin, The sun was dipping low again. I made dinner, just a simple can of stew heated on the propane burner, then settled on the porch as the night crept in. That was when I noticed something strange. The forest had gone completely silent. Not just quiet, but utterly devoid of sound. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just a thick, heavy stillness pressing in from all sides. I sat there, listening, waiting for something to break the spell, but nothing did. I tried to shake it off, blaming my own nerves. It was probably nothing. Maybe the wind had shifted, or a predator was moving through the area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went inside, locked the door, and made sure the shutters were closed tight. The unease settled deep in my gut, making sleep harder to find. When I finally drifted off, it was restless, filled with vague, uneasy dreams that slipped away as soon as I tried to recall them. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, just that my heart was pounding, my skin clammy with sweat. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep just outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I strained to listen, but the silence had returned, thick and suffocating. I stayed frozen, every muscle locked in place, waiting for another sound. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself I must have imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The dirt was dry and loose, no clear tracks, nothing out of place. But that didn't mean much. The feeling of being watched clung to me, an itch I couldn't scratch. That day, I didn't wander far. I stayed close to the cabin, gathering firewood, keeping my hands busy. The silence in the woods came and went in waves, never lasting long enough to make sense of it. I tried to convince myself it was normal, but deep down, I knew better. That night, I locked the door, latched the shutters, and kept my hatchet within reach. I tried to sleep, but every little creak of the cabin made my pulse jump. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate step, then another, closer this time. Something was outside the cabin. I forced myself to stay still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. The silence stretched on, pressing against me, filling the cabin like a living thing. Then the door handle rattled. Not violently, just a slow, testing turn. A deliberate movement. I gripped the hatchet so hard my knuckles ached. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The handle rattled again, then stopped. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, retreating, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep at all after that. By first light, I was packed and ready to go. I didn't bother with breakfast. I threw my gear in the SUV, locked the cabin behind me, and drove without looking back. The entire way down that dirt road, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. I never did. When I got back to town, I called my friend and asked if anyone else knew about the cabin. He hesitated before saying no. His family hadn't used it in years. No one should have been out there. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't want to talk about it. I haven't been back since. I don't know why I rented the cabin. Maybe it was the quiet I wanted, or maybe I just needed to get out of the city, away from people. Either way, I paid for 4 nights in a remote cabin deep in the Oregon wilderness, about 15 miles from the nearest town. The listing promised seclusion, surrounded by dense forest with no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and only a wood stove for heat. It was exactly what I was looking for. The drive took longer than I expected. The last stretch was on a dirt road full of potholes, winding up through thick pine trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low. It wasn't much. A small wooden structure with a steep roof and a wraparound porch. A creek ran nearby, gurgling over rocks. No other cabins, no cars, no sounds except the water and the wind in the trees. I parked and grabbed my bags. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just like the email said. The door stuck a little when I pushed it open. Inside, the place smelled like old wood and dust. A single room with a bed pushed against one wall, a kitchenette with an old propane stove, and a wood stove near the door. A bathroom was attached, but there was no running water, just a metal basin and a pump outside for washing up. A few old oil lamps sat on a shelf, along with a pile of firewood stacked neatly by the stove. I set my bags down and started a fire. The cabin got cold fast, and I could already feel the damp air settling in. As the fire crackled, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped back outside to get a better look at my surroundings. The forest pressed close. Towering trees, thick undergrowth, and absolute stillness. No distant hum of cars, no voices, nothing. Just the wind shifting through the branches. I stood on the porch for a while, listening, adjusting to the silence. Felt different out here, heavier. I ate a cold sandwich for dinner, then read by flashlight until I got tired. The bed creaked under me as I shifted, trying to get comfortable. The quiet was absolute, almost suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat. Eventually, I fell asleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had died down, leaving the room dim and shadowy. I lay still, listening. Something was off. The wind had stopped. The forest was completely silent. Then I heard it. Faint sound outside. A single, deliberate footstep on the porch. My whole body tensed. I held my breath, straining to hear. Another step, slow and careful. I sat up as quietly as I could, reaching for the flashlight. My fingers fumbled over the cold metal. I clicked it on and aimed it at the window. Nothing, just darkness pressing against the glass. I stayed like that, unmoving for what felt like hours. But the sound didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer passing by. I lay back down, gripping the flashlight tight, and somehow drifted off again. The next morning, I went outside to check. The air was crisp, the forest waking up with birdsong. I stepped onto the porch and looked around. No footprints, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. Shaking it off, I spent the day hiking around the area, following an old trail that wound deeper into the woods. I came across a clearing with the remains of an old fire pit, but no signs of recent use. The trees were thick, their trunks covered in moss. It was beautiful, but there was an odd feeling in the air, something I couldn't quite place, like the forest was watching. I got back to the cabin before dark, made a fire, and sat outside on the porch as the sky dimmed. The quiet settled in again, heavier than before. Then, just as I was about to go inside, I saw it. Something moved in the trees. A shadow, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the undergrowth. I froze, my pulse slamming in my ears. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there. I turned my flashlight on, aiming it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. I exhaled shakily, backing toward the door. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I locked the door behind me, shoved a chair against it just in case, and stayed awake for a long time, listening. I didn't sleep much that night. By the third day, I wanted to leave. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the unease curling in my gut. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed, like something unseen was watching from the trees. I packed up my things that evening, planning to leave first thing in the morning. I didn't want to drive that dirt road in the dark, not with how rough it was. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, breathing, close, just outside the window. My stomach turned to ice. I reached for the flashlight with shaking hands, but I didn't turn it on. Instead, I lay there, heart pounding, listening. The breathing was slow, steady, right outside the glass. Then, the softest sound, the creak of the porch boards. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The doorknob rattled. That was it. I jumped up, grabbed my bag, and shoved my boots on with shaking hands. I didn't care if it was pitch dark, if the road was bad. I wasn't staying another second. I yanked open the door, the cold air rushing in, and swept my flashlight across the porch. No one was there, but something was out there. I knew it. I locked the door behind me and sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of there, my headlights bouncing over the uneven dirt road. I didn't look back. I drove straight through the night, only stopping when I reached a gas station near the highway. My hands were still shaking as I got out of the car. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the fluorescent-lit air, trying to steady myself. I never found out who or what was out there. I never went back. I don't think I ever will. I had planned this trip for weeks. The cabin sat deep in the woods, a few miles off an old logging road, surrounded by nothing but dense pines and the occasional break in the trees that gave way to a long stretch of empty sky. It wasn't a vacation rental or a cozy getaway. It was an old hunting cabin that had been abandoned for years, left to the elements. I'd found out about it through a friend who used to work for a timber company. He mentioned it in passing, saying it was remote and untouched, the kind of place where you could be alone for days without seeing another soul. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive up took most of the day. The road got worse the farther I went, turning from gravel to dirt to something barely more than a rut cutting through the forest. My truck handled it fine, but I still drove slow, trying not to bottom out. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches reaching over the road like they wanted to block out the last bit of sky. I hadn't seen another car for miles. No houses, no signs, just endless trees and the narrow strip of road disappearing into the distance. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set. It was a squat, weathered structure, barely more than a single room with a slanted roof. The windows were grimy, the door slightly warped from years of rain and snow. I parked the truck a few yards away and sat for a minute, just listening. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. No birds, no insects, just an eerie stillness that made my skin prickle. I grabbed my bag and stepped out. The air was cool and smelled like damp earth and pine. I walked up to the cabin and pushed the door open. Stuck at first, then gave way with a groan. The inside was exactly what I expected. Dust-covered wooden floor, an old table with a few rusted nails scattered on top, a stone fireplace filled with ash. A single cot sat against the far wall, its thin mattress covered in a layer of dirt and mouse droppings. I swept it off with my boot, set my bag down, and checked the rest of the place. There wasn't much to see. A few empty shelves, some rusted tools in the corner, an old axe with a splintered handle. The walls were covered in scratches and stains, marks left behind by time and weather. It smelled musty, like damp wood and decay, but it was dry and solid. Good enough. I went back outside to gather firewood. The sun had dipped below the trees, and the temperature was dropping fast. I found a pile of half-rotten logs near the edge of the clearing and picked through them, grabbing the driest pieces I could find. As I worked, I kept glancing toward the trees. Something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a sense that the woods were watching me. I shook it off, told myself I was just being paranoid, and carried the wood back inside. The fire took a while to catch, but once it did, the small room filled with a flickering orange glow. I sat down on the cot, ate a cold can of beans, and listened to the crackling of the flames. The silence outside was thick, pressing against the walls like a physical weight. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just that unnatural stillness. I tried to sleep, but the quiet gnawed at me. Every creak of the old wood, every flicker of movement in the fire's glow sent my nerves on edge. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. I woke up to a sound, a single, sharp crack like a branch snapping underfoot. My eyes shot open. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. I sat up slowly, straining to hear past the pounding of my own heartbeat. The silence stretched on. Then another sound, a soft rustling just outside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up. My boots felt too loud on the wooden floor as I moved toward the door. I hesitated, then turned the handle and pushed it open. The night was dark. The trees loomed inky black against the faint glow of the embers inside. I swept the flashlight across the clearing. Nothing. The hairs on my arms stood up. I knew I'd heard something. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. The ground was undisturbed, no tracks, no movement, but the feeling was still there, that sense of being watched. I took a slow step forward, then another. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the edge of the tree line. My stomach clenched. There, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. I froze. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. At first, I thought it was just a tree, some trick of the light. But then it moved. A slow, deliberate shift, just enough to let me know it wasn't my imagination. I took a step back toward the cabin, my breath coming faster. The figure didn't move closer, didn't react at all. It just stood there, barely visible, watching. I went inside and shut the door, locked it. My hands were shaking. I backed away, grabbed my knife from my pack, and sat by the fire, staring at the door. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I didn't sleep. Every time my eyes started to close, I thought I heard something outside. Movement, breathing, the faintest whisper of footsteps. When dawn finally came, I opened the door and stepped outside. The clearing was empty. The figure was gone. But on the ground, right where it had been standing, was a single boot print. I didn't stay to investigate. I packed my things, threw them in the truck, and left without looking back. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I didn't try to rationalize it. All I know is that something was out there that night, watching, waiting, and I have no intention of ever going back to find out what it wanted. I got the cabin for cheap, which should have been my first red flag. It was the kind of deal you find on a rental site and hesitate over, thinking, this seems too good to be true. But money was tight, and I wanted somewhere quiet to get away for a few weeks. The listing described it as secluded, with no nearby neighbors, surrounded by thick forest, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. That sounded perfect. The road to the cabin was rough, just a narrow dirt path that twisted through dense trees. By the time I reached the place, my tires had kicked up so much dust I couldn't see my back window. The cabin itself was simple, a small single-story structure with a covered porch and a metal roof that looked rusted in spots. It was mid-afternoon, but the thick canopy overhead made it feel later. I killed the engine and sat there for a second, taking it all in. No cell service, no other houses in sight, just trees and silence. The key was under a rock by the door, exactly as the owner had said it would be. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and stale air, like it hadn't been used in a while. There were 2 rooms, a main living space with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a bedroom in the back with a single narrow window. The furnishings were minimal. A table with 2 chairs, a worn-out couch, and a bed that looked like it had been there for decades. The first night was uneventful, but I had trouble sleeping. The silence out here was different from what I was used to. In the city, there's always background noise, cars, voices, the hum of streetlights. Out here, there was nothing. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of civilization. Just a heavy, suffocating quiet. Every time I started to drift off, I swore I could hear something faint, like the creak of wood settling or movement outside. I told myself it was just the cabin adjusting to the cool night air. By the 3rd day, I'd fallen into a routine. Morning coffee on the porch, reading, hiking the trails nearby, collecting firewood in the evenings. I liked the solitude. It gave me time to think, to clear my head. But at night, that uneasy feeling returned. The first time I saw the footprints, I had just come back from a long walk down to a creek about a mile away. They were in the dirt just outside the porch, half erased by the wind. Large, booted prints, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin and then disappearing back into the woods. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe the owner had come by, but why would he? I had the place booked for the whole month, and he hadn't mentioned checking in. Maybe a hiker? That didn't sit right either. This place was too far off any marked trails, and I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived. I told myself it was old, left there before I got here, and went inside. That night, I slept with the knife I'd brought lying next to me on the bed. The next morning, the footprints were gone, wiped away by the wind, I assumed. I checked the area, walking around the cabin, scanning the tree line. Nothing. I was being paranoid. A week alone in the woods will do that to you. I forced myself to shake it off, to go about my day like normal. The door was unlocked when I came back that afternoon. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. My stomach felt tight. I nudged the door open slowly, listening. The cabin was exactly how I had left it. No signs of anyone inside. Nothing missing. But I knew I had locked it. That night, I barricaded the door with the table and put the knife under my pillow. I barely slept. Every sound made me jolt awake, heart pounding. The wind against the roof, the creak of the wood, the occasional rustle from the forest outside. Then I heard it, not from inside the cabin, but just outside the bedroom window. The unmistakable sound of someone breathing. It was deep and slow, like whoever it was didn't care if I heard them. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then, a quiet tap against the glass. Not a knock, just a single, deliberate tap. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Whoever was out there stayed for what felt like hours before walking away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care about getting my money's worth anymore. I just wanted to leave. But when I got outside, the only road leading back to town was blocked. A tree had fallen right across the path. I don't know how it happened. There hadn't been a storm, no wind. It looked fresh, like it had been cut and pushed over. My hands were shaking as I stood there, staring at it. Whoever had been outside my window had done this. They didn't want me leaving. I went back inside, locked the door, and grabbed the old axe I had found in the cabin's shed. I wasn't staying another night. I spent the next 3 hours hacking through branches, pulling and dragging them out of the way, my eyes constantly flicking to the trees, waiting for someone to step out. When I finally cleared enough space to drive through, I didn't waste time. I threw my bags into the car, turned the key, and gunned it down the dirt path. I didn't stop until I reached town, heart still hammering. I never went back for my deposit, never contacted the owner. I don't know who was out there with me, but I know one thing: I wasn't alone. I never should have gone to that cabin alone. The place belonged to an old friend of my father's, a guy named Bill who had retired years ago and spent most of his time in Florida now. He let my father use the place whenever he wanted, and growing up, we spent some summers there as a family. It was isolated, a small wooden cabin built deep in the mountains of northern Idaho, with nothing but forest stretching out in every direction. The nearest town was nearly an hour away, and even that was just a collection of a few buildings clustered along a single road. I had driven up late in the afternoon, my truck bouncing over the rutted dirt road that wound its way through the pines. It had rained a few days before, and some of the deeper puddles were nearly big enough to swallow a tire. The trees pressed in close, their shadows stretching long as the sun started to dip toward the horizon. The only sound was the occasional chirp of birds and the low hum of my engine. It was the kind of silence that could feel peaceful or suffocating, depending on your mood. The cabin itself was exactly how I remembered it. One story, a simple slanted roof, a porch that sagged just slightly at one corner. It wasn't much, but it had always felt solid. A safe place. I parked the truck, grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, and made my way up the steps. The door stuck a little, swollen from the damp air, but after a firm shove, it swung open with a groan. The inside smelled like wood and dust, untouched for months. I set about getting things in order, unrolling my sleeping bag on the old cot in the main room, stacking some firewood by the stove. There was no electricity, just a couple of old gas lamps and a wood-burning stove for heat. The well still worked, at least, and after letting the tap run for a minute, the water cleared up enough to drink. I had brought plenty of supplies, but I planned to do some fishing down by the lake a few miles away. That was the whole reason for coming up here. Some time away from everything, just me and the quiet. By the time I finished unpacking, the sun had slipped behind the trees, and the cabin was wrapped in deepening shadows. I lit one of the lamps and set it on the small table in the center of the room. The light flickered, barely pushing back the dark. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp wood. I stood for a moment listening. Nothing. No wind, no crickets, just silence. I stepped outside onto the porch, stretching my arms and breathing in the cool evening air. The trees loomed like black shapes against the last pale light of the sky. The road I had come in on was just a dark tunnel cut through the woods, barely visible now. I knew the nearest neighbor was miles away, and yet, as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a feeling. I shook it off and went back inside, latching the door behind me. I wasn't scared, not really. I had spent enough time out here to know how easy it was to let the isolation play tricks on your mind. I pulled off my boots, climbed into the cot, and closed my eyes. The cot creaked slightly as I shifted, the only sound in the cabin. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake, staring into the darkness. Something had woken me. I held my breath, listening. A sound, faint, almost too quiet to notice, but it was there. Footsteps, not the rustling of an animal in the brush, not the scampering of some small creature along the porch. These were deliberate, steady steps, moving somewhere just outside the cabin. My pulse hammered in my ears. I turned my head slowly toward the window. The glass was just a dark square, reflecting the faint light from the lamp. I couldn't see anything outside. The footsteps stopped. I lay there, waiting, every muscle in my body tense. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe my mind had twisted the sounds of the woods into something they weren't. I sat up slowly, reaching for the flashlight on the small table beside the cot. My fingers wrapped around the metal and I clicked it on. The beam cut across the room, steady and bright. I swung it toward the window, half expecting to see a face staring in at me. Nothing, just the trees beyond. I exhaled, feeling a little foolish. I set the flashlight down, lay back down, and stared at the ceiling. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak from the porch. I sat up fast, heart pounding. I had locked the door, but that suddenly felt like a flimsy barrier. My mind raced. If someone was out there, they had no reason to be. There was no reason for anyone to be miles deep in the woods in the middle of the night, standing on my porch. I grabbed the knife I kept with my gear and slid out of the cot, moving silently toward the door. I pressed my ear against the wood. The silence stretched. Then another step, closer to the door this time. I gripped the handle of the knife tighter. My breath came slow and steady. My mind flipped through possibilities. Someone lost? A hunter? But why would they be out here moving like that, slow and deliberate? Then the doorknob turned, just slightly, attesting motion. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The knob rattled again, harder this time, then silence. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, my muscles locked in place. Finally, after what had to be at least an hour, I moved toward the window, careful to stay out of direct sight. I angled my head, peering out just enough to see. Nothing. The porch was empty. The woods beyond, dark and still. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I packed my things and left. I didn't waste time. I loaded up the truck, double-checked that I hadn't left anything behind, and got in. As I pulled away, my eyes flicked to the porch one last time, and then I saw them. Footprints. Large human prints, leading from the edge of the trees to my door. But there were no prints leading away, just the ones coming in. I pulled my truck up the long, winding dirt road, the crunch of tires on loose gravel the only sound in the dense forest surrounding me. I had rented the cabin site unseen, one of those online listings with a handful of pictures that didn't give much detail beyond a promise of solitude and a place to get away. That was what I wanted, needed really, just some time to reset, away from people, away from the constant buzz of everyday life. The place wasn't much to look at when I arrived. The pictures had been taken at flattering angles, but in person, the cabin looked older, a little more run down than I expected. The wood was weathered, the front porch sagged a little, and the whole structure leaned just slightly to the left. It was remote, though, deep in the forest with no sign of other people for miles. That part, at least, was true. I killed the engine and sat in the quiet for a moment. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Birds called to each other in the canopy above, and somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Probably a deer. I wasn't worried about wildlife. I had spent enough time in the woods to know that most animals wanted nothing to do with humans. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and climbed out. The cabin's front door was unlocked, just as the owner had promised in the confirmation email. The key was supposedly on the kitchen counter. I stepped inside and was immediately hit with the smell of old wood and dust. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. The layout was simple. A small living area with a worn-out couch and a fireplace, a kitchenette with a tiny stove and a mini fridge, and a single bedroom with a full-sized bed. There was a small bathroom off the bedroom, and that was it. Bare bones, but it would do. I found the key on the counter, just like they said. Next to it was a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it, expecting some kind of welcome note, maybe instructions on where to find extra blankets or how to work the heater. Instead, the note was short, written in a hurried scrawl. Keep the doors locked. If you hear anything at night, do not open the door. Do not go outside. I frowned at it. Probably some kind of joke. A way to mess with the renters. I had seen things like this before. People trying to add an element of horror to an otherwise boring cabin stay. I tossed the note aside and started unpacking. The first day was uneventful. I hiked a bit, explored the area around the cabin, and took in the quiet. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. That night, I made a simple meal, read a book by lantern light, and eventually climbed into bed. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It was that kind of wakefulness where you aren't sure what stirred you. I lay there, listening. The wind had picked up, sending tree branches scraping against the cabin's roof and walls. That must have been it. I turned over and was about to drift back to sleep when I heard it. A sound outside. It wasn't the wind, not an animal. It was the distinct sound of footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, my heart starting to pick up its pace. The steps were slow, deliberate. Someone was out there. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? Someone from a nearby town? But I hadn't seen anyone. No signs of another cabin, no vehicles. Nothing. The steps stopped right in front of the door. I waited, listening. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then the door handle rattled. I sat up, every nerve in my body on edge. The person, whoever they were, was trying to get inside. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but when I checked, I had no signal. No surprise. I hadn't had service since I got close to the cabin. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and grabbed the small hatchet I had brought for chopping wood. I moved toward the front window, trying to get a look outside without being seen. But there was nothing there. No person, no movement. Just darkness and trees swaying in the wind. Then, something moved in my peripheral vision. A shadow, shifting just beyond the porch light's reach. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. The door handle rattled again, harder this time. A long pause, then slow, retreating footsteps. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I tried to convince myself it had been an animal. Maybe a bear sniffing around. Maybe just my imagination. But I knew what I heard. And when I went outside to check, I found footprints in the dirt leading up to the porch. Human footprints. I locked the doors, double-checked all the windows, and told myself I'd stay one more night. If anything happened again, I'd pack up and leave first thing in the morning. That night, it happened again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps, the same rattling at the door. But this time, there was something else. A light tapping at the bedroom window. I stayed in bed, gripping the hatchet, forcing myself not to move. The tapping continued, light and rhythmic. Then a pause. Then another tap. I didn't check the window. I didn't want to see what was standing out there. The sound stopped just before dawn. When the sun finally rose, I went outside again. The footprints were back, fresh in the dirt. They circled the cabin, stopped beneath the bedroom window. That was enough for me. I packed up in minutes, throwing everything into my bag and getting out as fast as I could. I didn't even bother locking the door behind me. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. I never found out who or what had been outside the cabin those nights. I never reported it, never went back. I don't think I ever will. I had driven up to the cabin expecting nothing more than a quiet, solitary weekend. It was one of those small, single-room hunting cabins deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. I'd rented it online from an older man who lived out of state. No neighbors, no cell service, just me, the trees, and the sound of the river a few hundred yards away. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive-in had been uneventful. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, full of deep ruts and loose rocks. I had to take it slow, my tires skidding slightly in places, but I made it in just before sundown. The place was simple. A single room with a wood stove, a cot, and a small table. There was a well out back for water and an outhouse a little way into the trees. No electricity, just a couple of old oil lanterns hanging from nails in the wall. It smelled like damp wood and old dust, but it was clean enough. After unloading my gear, I locked my truck and walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking things out. There was an old shed nearby with a stack of firewood, a rusted-out barrel, and a few other odds and ends. Nothing unusual, just the typical stuff you'd expect at a remote hunting cabin. I walked down to the river to get a feel for the place before it got too dark. The water was running high and fast, probably from recent rainfall. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. It was peaceful. I made a small fire in the pit outside and cooked a simple meal, some canned soup and a sandwich. The sky was completely dark by the time I finished eating. The kind of dark that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I sat for a while just listening. The wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. Typical forest sounds. Nothing out of place. I doused the fire and went inside, locking the cabin door behind me. It had an old iron latch that slid into place, more of a deterrent than an actual security measure. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot and climbed in, listening to the night outside. I must have fallen asleep fast because the next thing I knew, I was awake in complete darkness, my body tense for no reason I could immediately place. It was dead silent outside. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence, the kind that makes your ears strain, searching for any kind of noise. I didn't move at first, just listening. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves just outside the cabin. It wasn't an animal. I knew that instantly. Animals move in quick, darting steps, pausing now and then to listen. This was different. These were slow, careful footsteps. One step, a long pause. Another step. Whoever it was, they were trying to be quiet. My pulse hammered in my ears. My truck was locked, and the cabin had no windows big enough to see through. I was completely blind to whatever was out there. I reached for my flashlight but stopped myself. If I turned it on, I'd give away my exact position inside. The footsteps continued, circling around the cabin. Slow, purposeful. I sat up as quietly as I could, heart pounding, barely breathing. Whoever it was stopped right outside the door. I stared at the latch, watching for any sign of movement. Then, nothing. Minutes passed. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. My fingers clenched around my pocket knife, though I knew it wouldn't do much good. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. But whoever had been out there was gone. Or at least they weren't making any more noise. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little creak of the cabin made me tense up. Every distant sound sent my pulse racing. I kept expecting to hear the footsteps return, but they never did. By the time the first hint of dawn started creeping through the cracks in the wood, I was already packed up and ready to go. I stepped outside, gripping my knife tightly, scanning the tree line. The air was cold, still carrying that early morning chill. The ground around the cabin looked undisturbed at first, but then I saw them. Footprints. They circled the entire cabin, leading up to the door and back into the trees. They were deep, fresh. Someone had been here, watching me. I wasted no time getting to my truck, throwing my gear inside, and starting the engine. The drive back down the dirt road felt much longer than it had on the way in. Every shadow between the trees felt like something watching me, waiting. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road, miles away from that cabin. When I finally had cell service again, I pulled over and called the number from the rental listing. A woman answered. I asked about the owner, explaining what had happened. There was a long pause before she told me that the man who had listed the cabin had died 6 months ago. The listing was supposed to be taken down. I hung up without another word. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing for certain. I will never go back to that cabin again. I should have never gone alone. I thought I needed the solitude. It was a chance to get away from the city, from the constant pressure of life, from people. Just me, a quiet cabin in the woods, and a week of nothing but reading, hiking, and sleeping without any obligations. It was supposed to be relaxing. The cabin belonged to an old friend. He'd offered it to me after I mentioned I was looking for a retreat. He warned me it was a bit rough, no electricity, no running water except for a hand pump in the kitchen, and only a wood stove for heat. But that was fine. I wanted simple. I wanted isolation. I drove 6 hours into the mountains, following a winding dirt road for the last 20 miles, barely wide enough for my car. When I arrived, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the clearing where the cabin sat. It was small, weathered, but sturdy looking. A single story with a pitched roof and a deep porch. Trees pressed in from every side, towering pines and bare-limbed aspens shaking in the wind. There was a fire pit out front and a shed about 20 yards away. My friend told me there was a composting toilet behind the cabin and a small creek a few hundred yards into the woods if I needed fresh water. I parked my car off to the side, grabbed my bags, and stepped inside. The air was stale, the kind that builds up when a place sits empty for months. I unlatched a window to let in some fresh air, unpacked my supplies, and set up a small battery-powered lantern on the kitchen table. The place was bare bones. A cot against one wall, a small wood stove in the corner, a table and 2 chairs, some old pots and pans hanging from hooks. There was a single locked cabinet in the corner, likely storing things my friend didn't want me getting into. I didn't ask. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I had lived in the city my whole life, where there was always a distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout from the street below, the buzz of lights. Here there was nothing, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I lay in my cot, staring at the wooden beams above me, listening to the wind outside. A branch scraped against the roof. I kept telling myself it was just a branch, but my mind played tricks on me, making it sound like footsteps, like something shifting just outside the cabin walls. I eventually drifted off, but my sleep was light and uneasy. The next day, I explored the area. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their trunks thick, their shadows long. I found the creek, ice cold and clear, running over smooth stones. The shed was filled with chopped wood, tools, and a few rusted-out pieces of old machinery. Everything seemed fine, normal. That night, it started again. That sound. At first, it was just outside, somewhere in the trees. A snapping branch, a rustle in the undergrowth. Animals, I told myself. But as the night dragged on, it came closer, more deliberate. Something walking. I sat up in my cot, holding my breath. The sound moved around the cabin, slow, heavy, not quite human, not quite animal. The porch creaked under weight. I strained my ears, my pulse hammering in my skull. Then, nothing. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting, my skin clammy and cold. Eventually, exhaustion won. I woke up stiff, my back aching. The sun was rising, pale light pushing through the trees. I stepped outside and checked around the cabin. No tracks, no disturbances. Maybe I had imagined it. The third night, I knew I hadn't. It started again, but this time, there was no hesitation. The sound came straight to the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. Something heavy. The The porch groaned. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't lit the wood stove that night, so there was no firelight, just the faint blue glow from my lantern. Then the doorknob rattled. A slow, deliberate test. Pull, then a push. Not forceful, not rushed, just testing. My skin went ice cold. I reached for the knife I kept beside my cot, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. The doorknob stilled. Then the window, the one I had cracked open that first day. I had latched it before bed, but now it wiggled, like someone was pressing against it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't know. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. I found prints in the dirt. Not animal, not barefoot. Boots, heavy, deep. Someone had been out there. Someone had walked the perimeter of my cabin, stood on my porch, tested my door, my window. I should have packed up then, driven away, but a stupid part of me refused to be scared off by some trespasser. The fourth night, I barricaded the door with the table, kept my knife close, my lantern off. I didn't sleep. I listened, came back. This time I heard breathing, slow, steady, just outside the window. Then a dragging sound, something being pulled through the dirt. My stomach twisted. I wanted to move to check, but I stayed frozen. The sound circled the cabin. Once, twice, then silence. The first light, I checked outside. Deep grooves in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged right past the cabin, leading into the trees. I couldn't do it anymore. I packed my bags, threw everything into my car, and peeled out of there so fast I barely registered the deep gouges in the dirt road, like something heavy had been dragged across it. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main highway, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. A few days later, my friend called, said he was heading up to check on the cabin. I told him not to. I told him what happened. He laughed it off, said it was probably some vagrant or some local messing with me, said I was overreacting. Then he went up there and found the lock on the cabinet broken, the rifle inside missing, and deep, bloody drag marks leading from the porch into the trees. I had never been one for cabin trips. I liked the idea of solitude, but something about being completely cut off from the outside world never sat right with me. But when an old friend of mine offered me a chance to stay at his family's remote hunting cabin deep in the Montana wilderness, I figured I'd give it a shot. He assured me it had all the essentials, with stove, plenty of dry firewood, a stocked pantry, even a small generator if I needed it. It seemed perfect. A full week away from everything, just me and the quiet. The drive out there took most of the day. The last hour of it was spent on an unmarked dirt road. Nothing but towering pines on either side. The ground was frozen solid, patches of snow sticking around in the shaded areas. The deeper I went, the more I realized how isolated this place was. I hadn't seen another house for miles, and my cell signal had dropped off completely about 15 minutes back. When I finally spotted the cabin, a small structure nestled between the trees at the end of the path, I felt an odd mix of relief and unease. It was basic but solid. A single-room structure with a loft, a metal chimney pipe sticking out from the roof, and a pile of split firewood stacked against one side. There were no neighbors, no other signs of human presence. Just me, the cabin, and the endless woods. The sun was setting fast, so I wasted no time getting inside. The inside was just as simple as I expected. A wood stove in the corner, a rickety wooden table with 2 chairs, a cot against the far wall, and a ladder leading up to the loft. Shelves lined the walls, filled with canned goods, tools, and a few old hunting magazines. The place smelled of dust, aged wood, and faintly of the smoke from past fires. The generator was tucked against the far wall, with a few spare gas cans beside it. My friend had been right. Everything I needed was here. I got a fire going immediately. The air inside was icy, my breath visible as I moved around. The wood crackled, warmth slowly spreading through the space. As the fire grew, the shadows along the walls deepened, flickering and shifting with each movement of the flames. It was quiet, too quiet. I don't know what I had expected, maybe some distant road noise or the hum of civilization far off, but there was nothing, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I settled in quickly, heating up a can of stew on the stove and eating straight from the pot. Afterward, I took out a book I had brought and tried to read by the dim lantern light, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound outside made me look up. A branch creaking in the wind, the soft crunch of snow settling, the distant call of some unseen bird. My mind kept expecting something more. A voice, footsteps, something just beyond the trees. But there was nothing. By the time I climbed into the cot, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The room was comfortably warm, but I still pulled my sleeping bag tight around me. Lying there in the silence, I found it hard to relax. The quiet was oppressive, the kind that made you feel like you weren't really alone, like something was just out of sight, watching. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a sound. A dull, rhythmic thumping. I lay still, listening. It was faint but steady. A slow, deliberate sound coming from somewhere outside the cabin. My heartbeat picked up, my mind racing through possibilities. An animal? A deer brushing against the cabin? Maybe just the wind knocking a loose branch against the wall? I sat up slowly, the sleeping bag rustling as I moved. The sound continued, a steady thump, thump, thump. I reached for the flashlight on the table, my fingers cold as they wrapped around the handle. The fire had gone completely out, leaving the cabin in near total darkness. The only light came from the pale moonlight filtering in through the small window. I debated for a moment before pushing myself up and moving toward the door as quietly as I could. I hesitated, then pulled it open. The cold hit me instantly, biting through my clothes. I stepped onto the small porch, my boots crunching on the frost-covered wood. The air was still, the trees unmoving. My breath fogged out in front of me as I turned my flashlight on and swept it across the clearing. Nothing. The snow was undisturbed. No tracks, no sign of anything that could have made the sound. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear past the ringing silence. But it was gone. I closed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking slightly as I stoked the fire back to life. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had just been the settling cabin, the wind, something normal. I tried to convince myself of that as I lay back down. But sleep didn't come easy after that. The next few days passed uneventfully. I explored the area a little during the daytime, keeping close to the cabin. The woods were beautiful but eerily empty. I saw tracks here and there. Deer, rabbits, something that might have been a coyote, but I never saw anything move. At night, I kept the fire burning longer, not liking the way the dark crept in so thickly around the cabin. Then, on the fourth night, it happened again. That same rhythmic thumping. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch in one swift motion, scanning the trees. And this time, there were tracks. Large, deep prints in the snow, leading from the edge of the woods to the side of the cabin, right beneath my window. I followed them with the beam of my light, my pulse pounding in my ears. They were spaced far apart, like someone or something had been taking long, deliberate strides. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire high, my rifle within arm's reach, listening for any sign that whatever had been outside would return. Morning brought no answers. The tracks were still there, but they had started to soften in the rising sun. I packed my things in silence. I had planned to stay another 3 days, but something in my gut told me I had overstayed my welcome. Whatever was out there, it knew I was here, and it had come close, too close. I left that afternoon, not looking back. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the woods, watching me go. But there was nothing. When I finally got back to civilization and cell service, I called my friend and told him about the tracks. He was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "Yeah, that's why my family stopped going out there." I didn't ask any more questions, and I never went back. I wasn't expecting the trip to be anything special. Just a few days alone in a rented cabin, a break from work and the constant hum of city life. I had found the place online, buried in a list of cheap off-season rentals. It was small, remote, and simple, exactly what I wanted. A dirt road led a few miles into the trees to a clearing where the cabin sat, surrounded by thick pines and a steep hill behind it. No neighbors, no cell service, just quiet. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun low in the sky. The road had been rougher than I expected, and by the time I parked, my hands were stiff from gripping the wheel. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the pictures, but I didn't mind. A single-story structure with weathered wood siding and a tin roof. It had a front porch with a couple of old chairs and a woodpile stacked against the side. There was a shed out back, half hidden by trees. I had no reason to go in there. Inside, the cabin was basic. A single room with a bed in one corner, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchenette. A door at the back led to a tiny bathroom. The place smelled like old wood and dust, but it was clean enough. I set my bags down, got a fire going in the stove, and settled in for a quiet evening. By the time the sun had fully set, the temperature had dropped fast. I hadn't expected it to be this cold. The wind picked up, rushing through the trees outside, making the walls creak. It was the kind of silence that wasn't really silent. Even with no other people for miles, the woods still made their own sounds. Branches shifting, distant animal calls, the occasional rustling of something moving through the undergrowth. I sat by the fire, reading, letting the warmth soak in. At some point, I dozed off. When I woke, the fire had burned low, and the room was darker than before. I checked the time. A little after 1 in the morning. The wind had died down, leaving an odd, heavy stillness in its place. Then I heard it. A single, deliberate sound. A footstep. Not an animal scurrying through the brush. Not a branch shifting in the wind. A footstep just outside the cabin. I sat up, heart hammering. The sound had come from the porch. I listened, barely breathing. Nothing, just the crackling of the dying fire. I told myself I imagined it, that my mind had twisted some other sound into something human. But then it came again. Another step. Slow, heavy. Someone was outside. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and clicked it on, aiming it toward the front door. I didn't move right away. I just sat there, listening. The sound didn't come again. I stood up, my pulse thudding in my ears, and crossed the room to the door. The lock was engaged, but there was no deadbolt, just a simple latch. I hesitated, then reached out and flicked the porch light on. The bulb buzzed to life, casting a dim yellow glow through the window. I pressed my face to the glass, angling the flashlight against it to cut the glare. The porch was empty. The chairs were where I had seen them earlier, the woodpile undisturbed. But something felt wrong. I stayed there for a long moment, staring out, waiting for another sound. Nothing. After a few minutes, I turned off the porch light and backed away from the window. I forced myself to breathe normally. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Or maybe the wind had knocked something loose. Either way, standing here panicking wouldn't help. I stoked the fire, sat back down, and tried to push the thought away. Took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke early. The fire had burned out, leaving the room cold. I got up, stretched, and went outside to check around the cabin. The air was crisp, the ground damp with dew. I walked along the porch, looking for any sign of tracks. Nothing. No footprints, no scuffed dirt, nothing out of place. But then I noticed something. The stack of wood by the cabin, the one I had barely touched, had been disturbed. Several logs had shifted out of place, a few scattered onto the ground. I hadn't done that, and I knew for certain the wind hadn't either. I tried to shake it off, but the uneasy feeling stuck with me through the day. I went for a long walk in the woods, trying to clear my head. The landscape was rugged, the trees dense, and I kept an eye out for anything unusual. I found nothing. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already sinking, the sky streaked with red and orange. I made dinner, got a fire going, and tried to settle in for the night. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Every time I glanced at the windows, I half expected to see something staring back at me. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, something knocked against the back of the cabin. Not hard, not frantic, just a single solid knock. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It had come from the back, near the shed. I grabbed the flashlight again, heart pounding. I waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. I moved to the back window, peering out into the darkness. The flashlight beam barely cut through the night. The shed stood there, half hidden by trees, its door slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it. The door had been closed when I arrived. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to lock the door and wait until morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't check now, I'd regret it. I stepped onto the porch, my breath visible in the cold air. The forest was still. I walked around the side of the cabin, the flashlight beam bouncing with each step. When I reached the shed, I hesitated. The door hung open just a few inches, enough to see darkness inside. I reached out and pushed it open. The inside was mostly empty. A few rusted tools, an old tarp, shelves lined with dusty jars. But in the dirt near the doorway, I saw them. Footprints, bare footprints, large ones. They led in from the trees and stopped at the door. There were no prints leading back out. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was inside the cabin. The door slammed shut behind me. I locked it, shoved a chair under the handle, and grabbed the hatchet from my bag. My hands were shaking. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, watching the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When morning came, I packed my things, threw everything into the truck, and left. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what had been out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Someone had been watching me, and they had been closer than I ever realized. I had rented a small, off-grid cabin deep in the woods for a week, looking to get away from everything. No work, no responsibilities, just me and the quiet. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-room structure with a wood stove, a twin bed, a small table, and a few cabinets stocked with enough canned food and dry goods to last a while. There was no running water, just a rain barrel outside and a nearby creek. The outhouse sat a short walk behind the cabin. It was the kind of place you went to be alone, to clear your head. The drive up had been rough. The dirt road twisted through miles of thick forest, and with each passing mile, the trees grew denser, the sky shrinking above me until it felt like I was tunneling into the wilderness itself. I had to navigate several washed-out sections of the road, my truck's tires spinning in the loose dirt before I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It was late afternoon by then, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds, insects, and the occasional rustling of something unseen moving through the underbrush. After unloading my gear, mostly food, a few books, a lantern, and my hunting rifle, I set about making the place feel like home. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for a while. Dust coated every surface, and a few dead leaves had blown in through the gaps in the door frame. I swept it all out, stacked some wood by the stove, and made sure the lantern had plenty of fuel. The solitude was exactly what I had hoped for. No cell signal, no noise except for the wind in the trees and the occasional creaking of the old cabin settling in the evening chill. That first night was uneventful. I sat on the small porch, listening to the distant hoot of an owl, watching as the last light faded behind the trees. The darkness out here was complete. No distant glow of city lights, no headlights on the horizon, just blackness. I crawled into bed early, letting the silence lull me to sleep. The next morning, I woke to an eerie stillness. The usual chorus of birds was absent, and even the wind had died down. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. Shrugging it off, I went about my morning routine, boiling creek water for coffee, stretching out my stiff muscles, planning how I'd spend the day. I decided to hike up to a ridge I'd spotted on the drive-in, hoping to get a better view of the surrounding area. The hike was tougher than I expected. The underbrush was thick, and the trail, if you could even call it that, was little more than a game path, winding through dense stands of pines and tangled thickets. After a couple of hours, I reached the ridge, sweating despite the cool morning air. The view was breathtaking. rolling hills of unbroken forest stretching for miles, with no signs of human presence anywhere. That's when I noticed it. Far below, near the edge of the tree line where my cabin stood, something moved. It was too far to make out details, but it was definitely a figure, walking near the clearing. My first thought was that maybe it was a hunter or a hiker who had gotten lost, but something about the way they moved put me on edge. Slow, deliberate, almost like they were looking for something. Or someone. I stood frozen for a long time, watching. The figure eventually disappeared into the trees, heading in the direction of my cabin. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my imagination running wild. Still, I made my way back down faster than I had come up, gripping my rifle a little tighter. When I finally broke through the trees into the clearing, I felt my stomach drop. The cabin door was open. I knew I had closed it. I was sure of it. Cautiously, I approached, stepping as lightly as possible. The inside looked undisturbed at first glance. My bags were still in the corner, my food untouched. But then I noticed the floor. There were footprints in the dust, ones that didn't match my boots. They were larger, heavier, like someone had been pacing around. I backed out of the cabin, scanning the tree-line, listening. Nothing. The silence had returned, thick and unnatural. That night, I locked the cabin up tight, wedging a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I lay in bed, my rifle close, every muscle tense. The woods outside felt different now. Not welcoming, not peaceful, watchful. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke suddenly to a sound. A slow, dragging scrape, like something being pulled through the dirt outside. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then a faint creak, the porch steps. Someone was out there. I sat up slowly, heart pounding, and reached for my rifle. The lantern cast a dim glow, barely enough to see beyond the small window. I could make out a shape, just a shadow in the darkness, standing at the edge of the porch. They didn't move, didn't knock, didn't speak. Just stood there. Minutes passed. Then, a low, shuffling sound as they turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Whatever this was, whoever that was, I wanted no part of it. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my truck. Before I left, I did one last sweep around the cabin. That's when I saw the footprints again. Fresh ones leading from the trees to my porch and then back into the woods. But it was something else that made my blood run cold. Carved into the wood of the porch railing were two words, rough and uneven like they had been scratched in with a knife. Not yours. I didn't stick around to find out what it meant. I drove out of there faster than I should have, the truck bouncing over ruts and rocks as I put as much distance between me and that cabin as possible. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing. I wasn't alone. And I never will be again in the woods, not really. There's always something watching, waiting. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for weeks. It was late September, the leaves had turned bright shades of red and orange, and the air was crisp enough that I could see my breath in the mornings. The cabin itself was a rental, something I had booked online after scouring through dozens of listings. It was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, exactly the kind of isolation I needed. No cell service, no noise from the road, no people. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The drive out was long, mostly dirt roads winding through thick forest. I passed the occasional hunting camp or an old farmhouse set far back from the road, but otherwise I was alone. My truck bounced over potholes and loose gravel, kicking up dust behind me. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, the sun was beginning to sink behind the trees. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, made of dark logs with a stone chimney on one side. It sat in a clearing, a small porch out front with a single rocking chair. The key was in a lockbox near the door, and after fumbling with the combination for a moment, I got it open. The door creaked when I pushed it inward, revealing a simple interior. A wood stove in the corner, a rough wooden table, a single bed against the far wall. It smelled like old wood and dust, like no one had been here in months. Maybe they hadn't. I dropped my bags inside and went back to my truck to grab the rest of my supplies. Firewood was stacked along the side of the cabin, but I had brought extra just in case. The nights would be cold. Once I had everything inside, I lit the wood stove, the fire crackling to life and sending a warm glow through the cabin. The only sound was the occasional pop of burning wood. I had never realized how loud silence could be. After a quick meal, I stepped outside to take in my surroundings. The forest was dark, the trees towering above me. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a branch. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. Even when I camped, there was always some kind of background noise. Distant cars, voices from nearby campsites, the hum of insects. But here, there was nothing. As I turned to go back inside, something made me pause. I wasn't sure what at first, just a feeling. The woods felt different, like they were watching me. I shook it off, chalking it up to my imagination. I had spent too much time in cities, that was all. The solitude was messing with my head. The first night was uneventful. I slept heavily, exhausted from the drive. When I woke the next morning, the air was colder, the fire nearly out. I threw on some more wood and made a quick breakfast, sitting at the table while the sun crept through the trees outside. Today, I planned to hike. There was supposed to be an old logging road a few miles from the cabin, one that led to a small lake. I packed some food, a water bottle, and my knife before heading out. The woods were dense, the trees packed so closely together that it felt like walking through a tunnel. The ground was thick with fallen leaves, my boots crunching with every step. I followed what remained of an old trail, barely more than a narrow path worn into the earth. It felt abandoned, forgotten. I hiked for over an hour, the quiet settling into my bones. It wasn't peaceful, it was too still for that. Too empty. When I finally reached the lake, I sat on the edge of the water, listening to the silence. It stretched out in every direction, thick and heavy. It should have been relaxing, but it wasn't. Felt wrong, like something should be here but wasn't. No birds, no movement in the water, just stillness. I stayed for a while before heading back. The hike back felt different. The forest pressed in around me, the air colder than it had been earlier. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just trees, just my own paranoia. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me. It was just nerves, that was all. A city person stuck in the woods, letting his mind play tricks on him. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint at first, just the crunch of leaves. I lay still, listening. It didn't stop. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer, but deer didn't move like that. They didn't pace, didn't linger. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat loud in my ears. The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then, after what felt like forever, they started again. Closer this time, right outside the cabin. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. The thin beam of light shook in my hands as I aimed it at the window. Nothing, just darkness. I stayed awake for hours, waiting, but the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. The next day, I checked around the cabin for tracks. The ground was covered in leaves, too many to show footprints. But I knew what I had heard. Something had been out there, watching, waiting. I spent the day inside, keeping the fire going, listening for any sound from the woods. By nightfall, the fear had settled deep in my gut. I wasn't alone out here. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew I wasn't alone. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. They came right up to the door. I sat frozen, my knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. The handle rattled, just once, just enough to tell me that whatever was out there wasn't an animal. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes stretched into hours. Finally, just before dawn, the footsteps retreated. Slow, deliberate, then silence. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things. I didn't care about the rental agreement. I didn't care about the money I had spent. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded up my truck, checking over my shoulder the entire time. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back at the cabin. It stood silent in the morning light, nothing out of place. But I knew what had happened. I knew something had been out there, watching me, testing me. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away, back in civilization. Even then, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. I don't know what was out there in those woods. I don't think I ever want to know. But I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back to that cabin again. The road up to the cabin was in rough shape. It wasn't paved, just a long stretch of dirt and gravel winding up into the mountains, barely wide enough for my truck. Deep ruts from old rainstorms made the ride bumpy, and every now and then, the tires kicked up loose rock that clattered against the undercarriage. It had taken longer than expected to get up here, but I was finally close. The sun had dipped low behind the ridge, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air had that crisp bite to it that only came in late autumn. I had rented the place for a week. It was one of those old cabins built decades ago, meant for hunting trips and weekend getaways. The owner had listed it as rustic, which was usually code for no plumbing and questionable insulation, but I didn't mind. I wanted the isolation, a break from everything. Just me, the woods, and a stack of firewood to keep me warm at night. The cabin sat at the end of a small clearing, tucked between a dense patch of pines. It was smaller than I expected, a simple log structure with a steeply pitched roof and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. The windows were dark, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I parked the truck beside it, stretching my legs after the long drive. The door was locked, just like the owner had said it would be, and I fished the key out of my pocket. The lock was old and stubborn, but after a few tries, it clicked open. The inside smelled like dust and aged wood. It was a single-room cabin with a stone fireplace along one wall and a cot tucked into the corner. A rickety table sat near the window, and a wood-burning stove stood next to a stack of split logs. No electricity, no running water, just a lantern and a few candles on a shelf. I set my gear down and checked the place over. There wasn't much to check. A few shelves, a closet with some spare blankets, and a door in the back that led to what I assumed was an old outhouse. It was simple, but it would do. By the time I had settled in, the sun was gone, and the temperature had dropped sharply. I built a fire in the stove, the dry wood catching quickly, and the small cabin filled with a comfortable heat. I ate a quick meal from my pack and sat on the cot, listening to the wind outside. It had picked up, rushing through the trees with a hollow sound. Sometime in the night, I woke up. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was darker than before. For a moment, I wasn't sure why I had woken up. Then I heard it, a sound just outside, near the trees, a crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. I sat up, my pulse quickening. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint rustle of branches against the roof. I strained to listen, but the sound was gone. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or something smaller, moving through the underbrush, but it had sounded close, too close. I got up and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. The beam cut through the dark as I stepped to the window. The trees stood still, dark silhouettes against the night sky. I couldn't see anything unusual, but that uneasy feeling lingered. I turned back toward the cot, shaking my head. I was overthinking it. Being alone in a place like this played tricks on the mind. I climbed back under the blankets, listening, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, sleep pulled me under. The next morning was cold, the frost clinging to the ground outside. I stepped onto the porch, stretching my arms, breathing in the crisp air. The forest was quiet in the early light, a thin mist hanging low between the trees. Then I saw them, footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't animal tracks either. A set of deep, heavy prints in the dirt, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin. They stopped near the window before turning back into the woods. Prickle ran up my spine. Someone had been here last night, standing outside, watching. I scanned the tree line, my hands clenching into fists. There was no sign of anyone, no movement between the pines. But someone had been close, closer than I was comfortable with. I followed the tracks a few steps before they vanished into the underbrush. There was no way to tell where they had come from or where they had gone. I spent the next few hours on edge, checking around the cabin, making sure nothing had been disturbed. I debated leaving early, packing up and driving back down the mountain. But a stubborn part of me didn't want to. I had come here for solitude, and I wasn't going to let some stranger scare me off. I told myself it could have been a lost hiker, someone passing through who had seen the cabin and gotten curious. Maybe they hadn't meant anything by it. Still, I kept my rifle close that night. The wind returned, howling through the trees as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every little sound made my skin crawl. I kept imagining those footprints, someone standing outside in the dark, just beyond the window. The fire in the stove burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Then I heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving along the side of the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for the rifle, my fingers tightening around the stock. The footsteps stopped near the porch. Then the creak of wood. Someone was on the steps. I sat up, every muscle in my body tense. The door was locked. I had checked it twice, but that thin wooden barrier felt like nothing in that moment. I waited, barely breathing. Seconds dragged by. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound was gone. I didn't move for a long time. My grip on the rifle was so tight my knuckles ached. I listened, ears straining for any hint of movement. Nothing. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light seeped through the trees, I was already dressed, my pack loaded. I wasn't staying another night. As I stepped outside, my stomach twisted. The footprints were back. More of them, deeper this time, circling the cabin. Whoever had been out there had spent more time near the porch. I scanned the tree line, heart hammering. No one. I didn't waste time. I threw my gear into the truck, started the engine, and backed down the path faster than I should have. Gravel crunched under the tires as I made my way down the mountain, the dense trees pressing in on either side. My hands were tight on the wheel, my pulse still pounding. I didn't look back. I never found out who had been up there. The owner of the cabin didn't have any answers. He said no one else was supposed to be on the property. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Someone had been watching, waiting, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out why. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. It sat alone at the edge of a dense forest, the kind of place that felt untouched by the world beyond it. The drive had been long, miles of winding dirt roads with no signs of life. I had rented the place for a week, hoping to escape from everything. Work, city noise, the constant pull of my phone. Just me, the quiet, and whatever I could find to do to pass the time. The cabin itself was nothing special. A single-story structure with a sloped roof, weathered wooden walls, and a small porch that creaked under my weight. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The living room had a couch, a coffee table, and an old fireplace. A narrow hallway led to a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and the bedroom. Simple, isolated, perfect. I set my bag down in the bedroom and took stock of the essentials. The place had a generator, but the owner had warned me to use it sparingly. There was a gas stove, a small fridge, and enough dry food to last a week. My phone had lost service miles back, and I hadn't brought a radio. I wanted to be disconnected. That first night, the silence was overwhelming. Even in the city's quietest moments, there was always some distant sound, traffic, people, something. Here there was nothing, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling, the whisper of wind against the trees. Took me a while to fall asleep. I woke up in the early hours, uneasy. The room was pitch black. My breath sounded too loud. Took a moment for me to realize what had disturbed me. Something had woken me. I held my breath, straining to hear past the hammering of my own heartbeat. Then a sound, faint, distant, something moving outside. I stayed still, listening. Could be an animal, I told myself. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I waited, staring at the ceiling, refusing to let my mind wander into irrational places. After a while, the sound stopped. I drifted back to sleep. Morning came slow. Sunlight leaked through the curtains, and the air was cold. I shook off the unease from the night before and forced myself into a routine. Boiled water for coffee, sat on the porch, tried to enjoy the solitude. Midday, I explored the surrounding woods. The trees stretched tall and dense, their branches tangled overhead, blocking out most of the sky. The forest floor was thick with leaves, twigs, and roots that made walking tricky. I found a small stream about half a mile from the cabin and followed it for a while, letting the sound of water fill the silence. I returned before dusk, not wanting to be caught too far from the cabin as darkness fell. That night, I made a small fire in the fireplace, cooked a simple meal, and read for a bit. It was calming, the kind of peace I had been hoping for. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, the sound was closer. Not an animal, not something scurrying in the underbrush. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving outside the cabin. I stayed still, my body rigid. The footsteps stopped near the front porch. My pulse pounded in my ears. I lay there, frozen, listening. Minutes passed. Then, the footsteps moved again, circling the cabin, slow and steady, like someone was walking the perimeter. I forced myself to breathe silently, keeping my movements minimal. The sound continued for what felt like forever, then stopped. I strained to hear, waiting, but nothing came after that. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept through the window. In the daylight, I checked around the cabin. No tracks, no disturbances, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. Maybe it had been the wind shifting things in the night. But by the third night, I knew it wasn't in my head. The footsteps came back. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They moved up the steps. The old wood groaned under the weight of something heavy. My chest tightened. My hands clenched into fists under the blankets. The door was locked. The windows were shut. But that didn't stop the feeling of being watched, of someone, standing just beyond the door. The footsteps moved again, circling the cabin, pausing near the bedroom window. I held my breath, willing myself to stay still. Then silence. It stayed that way for the rest of the night. Morning came and I was exhausted. I stepped onto the porch, checking for footprints in the dirt. Nothing, but I knew what I had heard. That day, I felt the weight of isolation pressing in. The trees seemed closer. The air felt heavier. I debated leaving, but the thought of packing up and driving those winding roads in the dark didn't sit right with me. Instead, I forced myself through the day, acting as if everything was normal. That night, I barricaded the door with the heavy coffee table. I placed a chair under the handle. I had no weapons, just a pocket knife, but I kept it close. I barely slept. Near dawn, something slammed against the front door. I shot up, heart hammering. The whole cabin shook with the force of it. The wood groaned. The chair under the handle rattled. Then silence. I waited, breath locked in my throat. Minutes passed. An hour. Then the first light of morning crept through the cracks in the curtains. When I finally forced myself to check outside, my stomach dropped. There, in the dirt outside the cabin, were tracks. Not boot prints, bare feet, large, wide, pressing deep into the soil. They led from the forest edge to the porch and back again. I packed my things in minutes. I didn't care about leaving the rental early. I didn't care about the long drive back to civilization. I just knew I had to leave. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced at the cabin one last time. The porch, the front door, the shadowed windows. And then, in the tree line, something moved. Not an animal, not a trick of the light. Something standing there, watching. I didn't wait to get a better look. I pressed the gas and didn't stop until I saw another car on the road hours later. I never looked back, and I never went back to that cabin.